Every story about power starts the same way if you go back far enough, with somebody terrified of losing it. And nobody in the history of anything was ever more terrified of losing power than the god you're about to meet's own father. So that's where we start, not with Zeus, with the man who tried to make sure Zeus never happened at all. His name was Cronus, and he'd gotten his throne the old-fashioned way by taking a sickle to his own father, a sky god named Uranus, and cutting him down to size. Literally, I won't get into the specifics of exactly what got cut, except to say that Cronus made very, very sure his father would never trouble him again. That's the family business, you understand. Nobody in this bloodline gets the throne, everybody takes it. And Uranus, bleeding and furious, and possibly the first person in existence to say, "Just wait," cursed his son on the way out, told him, "What you did to me, your own child will do to you. A son of yours will rise up and take everything, the same way you just took it from me." Now most men would hear a curse like that and think, well, that's dramatic, and go about their evening. Cronus was not most men. Cronus believed every word of it, and he built the rest of his life around making sure it never came true. He married his sister, again, family business, don't think too hard about it, a titan named Rhea, and when she started having children, Cronus did something that still makes gods wince when they tell it. He ate them. Not metaphorically, not ate them alive with worry, the way a modern father might. The moment each child was born, Cronus took the baby from its mother's arms and swallowed it whole, on the theory that a child who never gets a chance to grow up can never grow up to overthrow you. It's brutally logical if you can stomach the brutality, and Cronus, evidently, could stomach quite a lot. Hestia went down first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon, 5 children, 5 swallowings, and Rhea watched every single one of them disappear down her husband's throat, and was expected, I suppose, to simply accept that this was how things worked now. She did not accept it. By the time she was pregnant a 6th time, Rhea had had exactly enough of watching her family become her husband's meals. She went to her own mother, Gaia, the earth herself, older than every god you've met tonight, older than the sky Cronus had once cut apart, and asked for help. And Gaia, who had watched her own husband get overthrown by this very same son and had absolutely no love left for Cronus, was more than happy to give it. The plan was simple enough that you'll want to know why nobody thought of it sooner. Rhea would go somewhere far away to give birth, in secret, on the island of Crete, in a cave hidden deep in a mountain. And instead of bringing the baby home to be eaten like all the others, she would bring home a rock. A rock wrapped in swaddling clothes, dressed up like a newborn. Cronus, a titan who had ruled the known universe, outsmarted his own father, and eaten 5 of his own children without so much as checking their faces first, looked at that bundle, felt not one flicker of suspicion, and swallowed the stone whole. That's the kind of god you're dealing with here, powerful enough to reshape the heavens, not always smart enough to check what he's eating. And so, somewhere on Crete, in a cave on a mountain nobody important was watching, the 6th child of Cronus and Rhea took his first breath, entirely unaware that his own existence was already the exception to a rule his father thought was unbreakable. His name was Zeus, and he was, from the very first hour of his life, a problem his father didn't know he had. They hid him well. Rhea couldn't raise the boy herself. Cronus might notice a child who kept not getting eaten, so she left him in that mountain cave in the care of nymphs and a goat. I want to sit on that goat for a second, because she's one of my favorite details in the whole story. Her name was Amalthea, and depending on who's telling it, she was either a nymph who kept a goat, or she was the goat herself. Mythology's never been too fussy about the difference, and either way, she's the one who fed the future king of all the gods on nothing but goat's milk and honey in a cave, while his own father sat on a throne a considerable distance away, utterly convinced the succession problem had been solved. There's a version of this part where Zeus, later in life, broke off one of Amalthea's horns by accident and, feeling guilty about it, gave it the power to fill itself endlessly with whatever its owner desired: food, wine, treasure, you name it. That's where we get the phrase horn of plenty, cornucopia. Next time somebody puts one on a Thanksgiving table, you can tell them it started with a king feeling bad about hurting the goat that raised him. Gods have guilty consciences too. They just express them a little more permanently than the rest of us. But back in the cave, the bigger problem wasn't feeding the baby, it was keeping him quiet. Because Barbie's cry and Cronus, off on his throne, paranoid as ever, had ears everywhere, in the way that powerful, frightened men always seem to. If word ever reached him that a sixth child of Rhea's was crying in a cave on Crete, the game was over before it began. So Rhea recruited a group of warrior spirits called the Curates, armored dancers, essentially young men who clashed their swords against their shields in a great deafening rhythm every single time the baby so much as whimpered. Picture it, an infant who will grow up to be the most powerful being in the universe, and the thing standing between him and discovery is a bunch of guys banging pots and pans, more or less, timed perfectly to a baby's mood swings. It worked every single time that little God so much as hiccuped. The clash of metal on metal drowned him out, and on his throne, hundreds of miles away, Cronus heard nothing but the ordinary silence of a world he believed he'd already conquered. Here's the thing about tyrants, and you can carry this one with you: the moment they stop checking under the bed is the moment something starts growing there. And grow he did, not slowly, either. Gods don't really do slowly. Zeus went from infant to full-grown in what felt, by any human measure, like the blink of an eye, raised on goat's milk and the sound of swords, hidden his entire childhood from a father who had eaten every one of his siblings and had no earthly reason to suspect this one had gotten away. By the time he was grown, Zeus wasn't just strong, he was furious. You would be too, if you'd learned the story of your own family the way he must have, that his father was, right now, walking around with 5 of his own children sitting undigested in his gut, having swallowed them the moment they were born, and had done it without so much as a second thought. Somebody was going to have to do something about that. Zeus decided it would be him. Now you don't walk up to a titan who's ruled the universe for an age and challenge him to a fair fight. Titans don't do fair fights. So Zeus, showing early on the exact quality that would define the rest of his life, didn't try strength first. He tried a trick. With help from Gaia, who again had absolutely no patience left for the son who'd overthrown her husband and was more than willing to help a grandson finish the job, Zeus got close to his father disguised as a cupbearer. Some versions say it was Metis, a clever titaness and one of Zeus's first real allies, who mixed the potion. Other versions have Zeus doing it himself. Either way, the plan was the same: slip Cronus a drink laced with an emetic, something to make him violently, thoroughly sick. And it worked exactly as horribly as you'd hope. Cronus drank it down without a second thought. The man really did have a blind spot for anything handed to him in a cup, apparently, and within moments, he was retching up everything he'd swallowed over the years. Out came the rock, disguised all along as baby Zeus, landing on the ground with an unceremonious thud that must have been deeply satisfying to witness. And then, one after another, out came Zeus's siblings: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each one fully grown despite having spent years inside their father's stomach, because that's simply how gods work. Time doesn't dent them the way it dents the rest of us. Try explaining that reunion to a therapist. 5 adult children, thrown up by their own father in reverse order of being eaten, blinking in the daylight for the first time in years, and the first face they see is a little brother none of them had ever met, who just saved their lives by way of an emetic and a rock. That's a family reunion I would pay to see from a safe distance. Cronus, understandably, did not take this well. His 5 swallowed children, now free, and his supposedly digested 6th, now very much alive and armed with a grudge. This was exactly the nightmare he'd spent his whole reign trying to prevent, and it had happened anyway, right under his nose, orchestrated by the son he'd never even bothered to check for. There's a lesson buried in there about the limits of paranoia. You can eat every child that's born to you. You still can't eat the one you never knew existed. What followed wasn't a quick fight. It was a war, one that would drag on for 10 years and reshape the heavens themselves, because Cronus wasn't going quietly and he wasn't fighting alone. He had the other titans behind him, the whole first generation of divine power, and Zeus had, for now, 5 newly freed siblings and a very large grudge. It was not, on paper, a fair fight. Somebody was going to need better weapons. Here's where the story gets interesting, because Zeus's first real move as a would-be king wasn't to strike at his enemies. It was to go looking for allies nobody else had thought to free. Deep beneath the earth, in a pit called Tartarus, so far down that a bronze anvil dropped from the surface would fall for 9 full days before it ever hit bottom, Cronus had locked away 2 groups of monstrous, powerful beings that even the Titans found unsettling. The Cyclopes, one-eyed giants, master craftsmen, the kind of smiths who could forge things no one else in existence had the skill to make. And the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handers, 3 brothers, each with 50 heads and 100 arms apiece, strength beyond anything else in creation, imprisoned simply because their own father and later their brother Cronus found their existence too frightening to allow near a throne. Cronus had feared them the same way he feared everything, as a threat to be buried, not a resource to be used. Zeus looked at the exact same beings and saw something else entirely. He went down into Tartarus himself and freed them. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you something about the kind of king Zeus was going to turn out to be long before he ever sat on a throne. His father's solution to anything frightening was permanent burial. Zeus's first instinct, given the exact same problem, was to let it out and put it to work. In gratitude, and let's be honest, probably also because it's simply wise policy not to cross someone who just freed you from 9 days of falling darkness, the Cyclopes forged Zeus a gift unlike anything that had existed before. A weapon made of thunder and lightning itself, the thunderbolt, not a metaphor, not a symbol, an actual physical weapon capable of leveling mountains and eventually entire armies of titans. They gave gifts to his brothers too. Poseidon got a trident capable of splitting the earth and stirring the seas into fury. Hades got a helm of invisibility, a cap that could make its wearer vanish entirely from sight, which, if you think about it, is exactly the kind of gift you'd give the brother who was about to inherit the underworld. 3 brothers, 3 impossible weapons, and now a war to actually use them in. The 100-handers, for their part, brought something even more useful than any single weapon: raw, overwhelming force. 3 beings, each capable of hurling boulders with 100 arms at once, throwing rock after rock after rock in a barrage no single titan, however powerful, could hope to withstand for long. Zeus had built, in a matter of days, exactly what his father never bothered to build in an entire age of rule. An army made of the very things everyone else was too afraid to let out of the dark. That's the whole trick of power, if you want the one-line version. Your enemies fear what they don't understand. The smart ones learn to use it instead. And with the thunderbolt in his hand and monsters at his back, Zeus turned his attention to the war his father had started the moment he swallowed his first child. It was time to finish it. They called it the Titanomachy, and if you want to picture it accurately, you have to throw out every human war you've ever heard of. This wasn't armies clashing on a plain. This was mountains getting picked up and thrown. This was the sea boiling, the sky catching fire, the whole architecture of the universe groaning under the weight of gods who could, without exaggeration, rearrange geography by accident. 10 years it lasted. A full decade of gods hurling literal mountains at one another, because when you're that powerful, throwing rocks and reshaping continents become the same activity. On one side, Cronus and the bulk of the older Titans, beings who had ruled the cosmos since before Zeus's grandfather lost his own throne, powerful enough that for most of that decade, the war hung in a stalemate nobody could break. Not for lack of trying, just evenly matched in the ugly way wars between comparably powerful sides tend to be. On the other side, Zeus, his 5 siblings, and the freed monsters from Tartarus, throwing everything they had against an enemy that simply would not fall. 10 years of that. Think about what that does to a person or a god. 10 years is long enough to grow up twice over, long enough for a young king who started this war on principle to become a young king who's fighting it because he genuinely doesn't know how to stop. The turning point, when it finally came from the 100-handers. Once they were fully unleashed, really let loose, all 3 of them, 300 arms hurling boulders in an unbroken barrage, no Titan army, however seasoned, however ancient, could stand against it. It wasn't strategy that broke the stalemate. It was sheer, overwhelming force, the kind that doesn't care how clever your battle plan is, because a mountain doesn't listen to clever. The Titans broke. Cronus, who had ruled for an age, who had eaten his own children to make sure this exact moment never came, watched his throne fall out from under him in the space of one sustained, decade-capping assault. Zeus didn't just win, he made sure it stayed one. He and his brothers took the defeated Titans and hurled them down into Tartarus, the same pit where the Cyclopes and 100-handers had once been locked away. Except this time, Zeus set the 100-handers themselves to stand guard over the gate, ensuring the Titans could never again claw their way back up into the light to trouble anyone. There's a certain poetry to that, if you look for it. The very monsters his father chained up out of fear became, under Zeus's rule, the permanent lock on his father's own prison. That's the difference between a king who rules through fear and one who rules through use. Cronus buried his fears and called it safety. Zeus armed his fears and called it victory. Not every Titan went down to Tartarus, mind you. A few had sided with Zeus from the start or found some other accommodation. Prometheus, for one, a Titan who'd read the writing on the wall early and thrown his lot in with the younger gods, a decision that would matter a great deal later in ways neither of them could have guessed yet. But Cronus himself, the god who ate his children, who tried to outrun a curse by devouring the very thing that curse warned him about, went down into the dark with the rest of his generation, and the age of the Titans, which had lasted since before memory itself, simply ended. A new age was starting, and somebody was going to have to run it. Now here's a detail I love, because it tells you exactly what kind of ruler Zeus was going to be, right from the very first afternoon of his reign. He didn't seize the whole universe for himself. He didn't declare himself sole ruler of everything and dare his brothers to argue. Instead, the 3 of them, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, the ones who'd fought hardest and bled longest, sat down and divided the cosmos up like reasonable siblings splitting an inheritance. They drew lots. I want you to sit with that for a second. 3 of the most powerful beings in existence, who had just spent 10 years throwing mountains at their own father, settled the single biggest question in the history of the universe: who rules what, with something close to picking straws. Zeus drew the sky, Poseidon drew the sea, Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, the one nobody particularly wanted, but somebody had to take. The earth itself and Olympus, they held in common, shared ground, belonging to all three equally, because some things are too big and too central to hand to just one brother, even in a family this competitive. Hades, by most accounts, wasn't thrilled with his draw. Ruling the dead is not, historically, a job anyone requests. But he took it, and he ruled it well, and in a strange way it suited him, a god who didn't crave the spotlight, who preferred order and quiet rule over the flash, and thunder his brother upstairs seemed to enjoy so much. And that division, sky, sea, underworld, became the basic shape of the whole world from that day forward, not because it was fair in any perfect sense. Fair had very little to do with it. It became the shape of the world because three brothers who'd just won a war together agreed on it, and nobody left standing had the strength, or frankly the interest, to argue. Zeus, drawing the sky, became king of the gods almost by default of geography. The sky sits above everything else after all, and a king who rules from up there gets to see, quite literally, further than anyone below him. That's not nothing. Vision is half of power. Zeus had both, and he knew it. He set up his throne on Mount Olympus, the tallest peak in the known world, high enough to brush the clouds, and began building not a kingdom exactly, not yet, but a family, a court, a pantheon. His 5 siblings settled in around him: Hestia, keeper of the hearth, the quietest, and in some ways the wisest of them all; Demeter, goddess of the harvest, whose moods would one day decide whether the whole world starved or flourished; Hera, well, we'll get to Hera. She becomes rather important to what follows, and not always in ways Zeus enjoyed. Poseidon came and went between his sea and his brother's mountain. Hades mostly stayed below, tending his own quiet kingdom and rarely bothering to climb the mountain at all. A new order, a new age. A young king, barely out of his own childhood cave, now sitting at the head of a family that had just finished overthrowing the previous management. You'd think, after 10 years of war, things might settle down for a while. They did not. Gaia, you'll remember, was the one who helped Zeus overthrow his own father. She'd had no love left for Cronus by the end, and she'd been more than happy to see him go. But Gaia's loyalty, it turned out, wasn't really to Zeus. It was to her own children, whoever they happened to be at the time, and when Zeus locked the Titans away in Tartarus for good, including several of Gaia's own offspring, she took that personally. Very personally. The kind of personally that leads a primordial earth goddess to go looking for one final weapon to use against the son of her son. She found one, or rather she made one mating with Tartarus itself, the dark pit at the bottom of everything, to produce a creature unlike anything that had come before or, honestly, anything that's come since. His name was Typhon, and if you want a picture, imagine the worst thing you can think of, and then imagine it's also on fire, and also has 100 snake heads instead of one, and also is taller than any mountain you've ever seen, with wings vast enough to blot out the sun and eyes that burned with actual flame. The gods, when they first saw him coming, did something you don't often hear about in stories like this. They ran. Every single Olympian, by most tellings, fled in outright terror at the sight of Typhon closing in, several of them, according to some versions, actually transforming into animals and scattering into Egypt to hide, too frightened to even hold their own divine shapes. It's not a flattering detail for the gods, and I like it precisely for that reason. It means somebody, at some point, sat down and admitted, yes, even the gods have a monster that scares them. Everyone ran, except Zeus. Zeus stood his ground, and what followed was the single hardest fight of his entire life, harder, by most accounts, than the whole 10-year war against the Titans combined. Typhon wasn't fighting for territory or vengeance in any organized sense. He was simply, overwhelmingly, more powerful than anything Zeus had ever faced, a living catastrophe built specifically to end him. At one point in the fight, and this is the part that always gets me, Typhon actually won. Caught Zeus off guard, wrestled the thunderbolt clean out of his hands, and while he was at it, tore out the sinews from Zeus's arms and legs, leaving the king of the gods disabled, helpless, stashed away in a cave like a piece of unfinished business Typhon meant to get back to later. Let that sink in for a second. The most powerful being in the universe, immobilized, defeated, waiting to be finished off, while the monster that beat him wandered off believing the job was already done. It took two other gods to fix what Typhon had broken. Hermes, clever, quick, exactly the kind of god you want on your side when brute strength has already failed, snuck in and stole Zeus's sinews back, along with help from a god named Aegipan, and got them reattached, restoring Zeus to full strength right under the nose of a monster who thought he'd already won. That's the whole trick of surviving as a king, if you want it in one line. It's not that you never lose. It's that you make sure your losses don't stay lost. Restored, furious, and considerably more motivated than before, Zeus went back after Typhon and finished what the monster had started. He drove Typhon clear across the world, hurling thunderbolt after thunderbolt, until finally he buried the creature under Mount Etna itself. The volcano, the one that still smokes to this day, if the old explanation is to be believed. Every rumble, every eruption is Typhon, still down there, still furious, still trying to claw his way back out from under a mountain a wounded king dropped on top of him. It's not a bad way to explain a volcano, honestly, better than most. Zeus had survived the single closest call of his entire reign, and he'd learned something in the process that would stick with him for the rest of his story. Even a king can be beaten. The trick isn't staying unbeatable. It's staying alive long enough to come back. Gaia wasn't done. Mothers rarely are, especially the primordial kind. Having failed with Typhon, she turned to another set of children, the giants born, according to the old accounts, from the very blood that had fallen to earth when Cronus first cut down his own father, all those ages ago. Blood spilled at the birth of this whole family curse, growing up eventually into an army with a single specific grudge. The Titans were gone, and somebody needed to avenge them. There was a catch, though a very particular catch, and it's the kind of detail that tells you the gods, whatever else they were, weren't operating entirely on their own. A prophecy held that the gods could never defeat the giants by themselves. They would need the help of a mortal. So Zeus, ever the planner, went looking for exactly the right one. He found him in Heracles, though we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, since Heracles' own birth is a story for later. Suffice to say, for now, that Zeus had, with characteristic foresight, already arranged for the existence of the one hero who would one day be strong enough and mortal enough to tip this particular battle in the gods' favor. The war itself, called the Gigantomachy, was fought across the earth in a running battle every bit as violent as the Titanomachy before it, if considerably shorter. Giants hurling boulders and flaming trees, gods answering with thunderbolts and tridents, and the swift, deadly cunning that came easier to this younger generation than it ever had to the Titans. Athene, Zeus's own daughter, born fully armored from his own head, a story we'll get to shortly, crushed one giant beneath the entire island of Sicily. Poseidon broke off a piece of the island of Kos and dropped it on another. It was, by any measure, an absurdly overpowered fight, gods swinging entire landmasses at their enemies like they were nothing more than particularly heavy rocks. And through it all, Heracles moved among the giants with his arrows, finishing off what the gods alone could not, exactly as the prophecy had demanded. By the end, the giants were broken, buried, scattered beneath mountains and islands across the known world, another layer of ancient enemy sealed away under the landscape itself, joining Typhon under Etna, joining the Titans down in Tartarus. If you ever wonder why so much of the old world seems to be built on top of something buried, well, now you know why. Two great wars behind him now, Titans, then giants. Zeus had done what his own father never managed in an entire age of rule. He'd faced down every serious challenge to his throne and won every single time. But surviving a war is one thing, building a family is another. And Zeus, as you're about to find out, was about to make that second part considerably more complicated than it needed to be. Not every Titan went down to Tartarus after that war, and not every punishment Zeus handed out came with a locked door. Some of them, he decided, needed a rather more public, ongoing kind of consequence, a sentence you could look up and see for yourself on any clear night for the rest of forever. Atlas had fought on the losing side of the Titanomachy, one of Kronos' most powerful generals, and unlike some of his kin who'd wavered or switched allegiances partway through that decade-long war, Atlas had fought hard right up until the very end. Zeus, victorious, decided that a Titan who'd fought that stubbornly deserved a punishment that would last exactly as long as his stubbornness had. He condemned Atlas to hold up the sky itself, not metaphorically, literally, physically, the entire weight of the heavens balanced on his shoulders, standing at the western edge of the world for all eternity, with no relief, no rotation, no other Titan ever offered up to share the load. There's a persistent little misunderstanding that's followed Atlas around for centuries, showing up in globes and statues everywhere, of a Titan hunched over holding the entire earth on his back. That's not quite the original punishment. It was the sky he carried, not the world beneath it, separating heaven from earth by main force, the one thing standing between an orderly cosmos and total collapse, holding up the very structure of existence with nothing but his own enormous, aching strength. Heracles, centuries later, on his own famous labors, actually managed to trick Atlas into a brief moment of relief, offering to hold the sky himself for just a little while, if Atlas would fetch him a set of golden apples from a garden only the Titan could safely reach. Atlas agreed eagerly, delighted at even a temporary reprieve, and once he returned with the apples, suggested, reasonably enough, from his perspective, that he simply deliver them himself and let Heracles keep holding the sky permanently instead. Heracles, no fool, agreed easily enough, and only asked for one small favor first. Could Atlas take the sky back, just for a moment, so Heracles could adjust his cloak to sit more comfortably under all that weight? Atlas, not thinking it through nearly as carefully as the situation demanded, took the sky back onto his own shoulders. And Heracles simply picked up the apples and walked away. It's a cruel little trick, if you think about it, offering a prisoner one moment of freedom just long enough to snatch it back permanently, but it's also structurally exactly the kind of trick this entire family specializes in, generation after generation. Zeus tricked his own father with a rock disguised as a baby. Heracles, Zeus's own son, tricked a Titan with a cloak that never actually needed adjusting. The methods passed down the bloodline as reliably as the thunderbolts do. Atlas is still there by the old accounting, still holding up the sky at the edge of the world, still paying every single day for having picked the wrong side in a war that ended thousands of years ago. Next time somebody describes carrying an unbearable weight as carrying the weight of the world, you can correct them gently. The weight Atlas carries isn't the world, it's everything above it, which is, honestly, so much worse. Remember Metis, the clever Titaness who helped mix the potion that made Kronos sick, Back at the very start of this whole family's history, Zeus never forgot what he owed her. And somewhere along the way, gratitude turned into something else, and Metis became his first real love, his first wife, by most tellings, before Hera ever entered the picture. There was a prophecy attached to her, though, the way there always seems to be in this family. Gaia warned Zeus, and by now you'd think he'd have learned to take these warnings seriously, that Metis was destined to bear two children. First, a daughter, wise and strong, and second, a son who would grow up to overthrow his father and take the throne of the gods for himself. You can guess how well that news sat with a king, whose entire origin story was built on exactly that pattern. Zeus, faced with a prophecy that was practically a photograph of his own childhood, decided he wasn't going to repeat his father's mistakes. He wasn't going to eat his children the way Cronus had. He'd freed his own siblings from that exact fate, after all, and had no interest in becoming the thing he'd overthrown. So he ate the mother instead. I understand how that sounds. It doesn't sound better. But by the internal logic of this family, it apparently qualified as an improvement. Swallow Metis whole, before she could ever give birth to the son who might one day pose a threat, and absorb her wisdom into himself in the bargain. Two birds, one horrifying method. For a while it seemed to work. Metis was gone, the prophecy's dangerous half, the son, never had the chance to be born, and Zeus, for good measure, found himself considerably wiser than before, having absorbed a titaness famous for her cunning directly into his own being. But you can't swallow a pregnancy and expect it to simply stop. Sometime later, the stories don't always agree on how long Zeus was struck by the single worst headache in the history of gods, a pain splitting his skull in a way that no amount of nectar or ambrosia could touch. Finally, in desperation, he had another god, Hephaestus, in most tellings, or Prometheus in a few older ones, take an axe to his own head and split it open. And out stepped Athene, fully grown, fully armored, spear in hand, shield ready, already wise beyond her years because, in a sense, she'd been marinating in Metis's own cunning the entire time she'd been developing inside her father's skull. It remains, even by the standards of this family, one of the strangest births in the whole story. No mother present in any conventional sense, no childhood at all, just a fully formed goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, walking straight out of her father's forehead like she'd simply been waiting for the door to open. Zeus loved her instantly, and more than that, he trusted her, made her one of his closest advisors on Olympus, the daughter who never once tried to overthrow him, because as it turned out, the prophecy's dangerous half really had died with Metis, swallowed along with her mother before he was ever born. It's a strange kind of victory when you think about it. Zeus avoided the fate his father feared by doing something arguably worse than anything his father ever did, and it worked out fine, and everybody at the dinner table simply moved on. That's the gods for you. The morality of the story bends to fit whoever's currently holding the thunderbolt. Now we come to Hera, and I want to tell you up front, this is not a love story with a happy ending, and everybody involved, including Zeus, knew it wasn't going to be one right from the start. Hera was Zeus's own sister. Again, this family, don't think too hard about it, one of the 5 siblings he'd rescued from their father's stomach all those years before. Powerful in her own right, queen material through and through, dignified in a way that made her a genuinely fitting match for a king. By most accounts, she turned Zeus down more than once when he first came courting. She wasn't interested in being just another conquest, and Zeus, for once in his life, actually had to work for something. So he cheated. Of course he did. That was rather the theme of his whole existence. The story goes that Zeus transformed himself into a small, bedraggled cuckoo bird, and let himself get caught in a storm right outside Hera's window, shivering and pathetic, the kind of small broken creature that any decent person would take pity on and bring inside to warm by the fire. Hera, seeing this poor freezing bird, scooped it up and held it against her chest to warm it. And that's when Zeus turned back into himself, right there, in her arms, having tricked his way into an intimacy she'd already turned down when he asked for it honestly. I won't pretty this up for you, because the old stories don't really pretty it up either. It's not a charming make cute. It's a god using deception to get what a goddess had already said no to, and it worked, because Zeus generally got what he wanted, one way or another, and the difference between wanted and consented to was not a distinction this family spent much time worrying about. They married. It became, officially, the great marriage of Olympus. Hera as queen of the gods, patron of marriage itself, and of women in every stage of their lives, presiding with real dignity and real power over a court that, in theory, should have made her the most secure and celebrated goddess in existence. In theory. In practice, Zeus's wandering eye did not slow down one bit the moment he had a ring on his finger, so to speak, and Hera spent the rest of her life finding out about it, over and over again, in ways that would make even the most patient queen furious. She became known, across the whole span of Greek myth, as the goddess of jealous, vengeful anger, and if you ever wonder why, well, you're about to hear a great many reasons over the course of the rest of this telling. Here's the thing worth saying plainly before we go any further. Hera's anger rarely lands on Zeus himself. He's the king. He's untouchable mostly by consequence of his own actions. Her anger lands instead on the women he pursued, many of whom had no more say in the matter than Hera herself had when that cuckoo bird first turned up outside her window, and on the children born from those affairs, who never asked to be caught in the middle of their parents' war. It's not a flattering pattern, and I'm not going to pretend it is one, but it's the pattern, and it runs through nearly everything that happens from here on, so keep it in your back pocket. Every time you hear about one of Zeus's affairs from this point forward, there's a decent chance Hera's already sharpening something in response. That's marriage on Olympus for you. Vows exchanged, thunderbolts on one side, unending patience on the other, and neither one of them ever really at peace. Let's pause the romance and the wars for a moment and just sit at the table, because it's worth knowing exactly who Zeus was ruling over once the dust from all those wars finally settled, and Olympus became less of a battle camp and more of an actual home. At the head of it, obviously, Zeus himself, king of the gods, lord of the sky, keeper of the thunderbolt, and by every account the loudest voice at any given dinner, whether the topic was a war on earth or which nymph had caught his eye that week. Beside him, Hera, queen of the gods, goddess of marriage and family, dignified and formidable, and as you've already heard at length, perpetually one report away from her next act of righteous fury. If Zeus was the thunder, Hera was the silence right before it, and everyone on that mountain, gods included, learned to read the weather in her face before she ever said a word. Poseidon came and went between his own sea and his brother's mountain, never quite comfortable being anyone's subordinate, prone to sulking when he felt overlooked, and prone to flooding entire regions when the sulking didn't get enough attention. Earthshaker, they called him, and he earned the title more than once, out of little more than wounded pride. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, quieter than most of her siblings, content largely to tend her own domain, until grief over Persephone turned her, briefly, into the most consequential goddess on the entire mountain, proof that even the gentlest member of this family could bring the whole world to its knees if pushed hard enough. Hestia, eldest, and in many ways wisest of the original six, kept the sacred hearth fire at the very center of Olympus itself, and famously wanted no part of the romantic chaos that consumed nearly everyone else in her family. Both Apollo and Poseidon once courted her. She turned them both down flat and asked instead for eternal virginity, a life apart from the endless scandal the rest of her family seemed to specialize in. Zeus granted it and gave her, in exchange, the honored place at the center of every hearth and every home in the mortal world, a quieter kind of immortality than thunderbolts and affairs, but a lasting one all the same. Then there's the second generation, Zeus's own children, who filled out the rest of the table. Athene, born from his own head, wisdom and strategy given form, close to her father in a way none of his other children quite managed. Apollo, golden and gifted, god of the sun and prophecy and music, born on a floating island after his mother's long ordeal. Artemis, his twin, fierce protector of the wild and of women, carrying her own mother's suffering into every act of ferocious protection she ever offered anyone else. Ares, god of war in its rawest, bloodiest form, generally disliked by nearly everyone at that table, including his own father, who once said, quite plainly, that Ares was the most hateful of all his children. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, born, in the older tellings, from sea foam that gathered where a very different piece of Uranus's own overthrow had fallen into the ocean generations, before Zeus was even born, technically older than Zeus himself, despite dining at his table, as if she was simply another daughter. Hephaestus, master craftsman, god of the forge, lame in one leg after being thrown from Olympus as an infant, some say by Zeus, some say by Hera, and the two stories disagree so thoroughly that even the old poets couldn't settle it. Hermes, quick-witted messenger, thief before he could walk, guide of travelers, and eventually of the dead on their final journey to the underworld. Dionysus, twice born, god of wine and festivity, welcomed to Olympus only after considerable persuasion, since a mortal-born god forcing his way onto a table of immortals wasn't, strictly speaking, standard procedure. 12 chairs, more or less, depending on which century's storyteller you ask and whether Hades, who mostly stayed below and rarely bothered attending, gets counted among them at all. A family built out of war, seduction, jealousy, and somewhere underneath all of that, something that occasionally, briefly, looked almost like love. It's easy hearing story after story of affairs and punishments and monsters buried under mountains to lose sight of the fact that this was, functionally, a family sitting down to dinner together on a regular basis, squabbling, taking sides, forgiving each other mostly because immortality doesn't leave you much choice, but to keep sharing a table with the same relatives, century after century, whether you've fully forgiven the last argument or not. That's Olympus, if you want the whole shape of it in one line, the most powerful family in the history of the universe, and still, underneath the thunderbolts, just a family doing what families do, loving each other imperfectly, hurting each other regularly, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, still showing up to the same table the next morning. There's a piece I skipped past too quickly earlier, and it deserves a proper telling of its own, because it explains where humanity actually came from in the first place, long before anyone was stealing fire or opening suspicious jars. In the years just after the Titanomachy, with Cronus and his generation freshly buried in Tartarus, Prometheus, spared the same fate as his kin, having sided with Zeus in the war, turned his attention to a task nobody had specifically assigned him. He knelt down by a riverbank, gathered up clay, and began to shape it, slowly, carefully, into the form of small, upright, curious creatures, built, some tellings say, in the image of the gods themselves, though considerably more fragile. Athene, watching him work, was moved enough by the project to lend her own help, breathing life into the little clay figures once Prometheus had finished shaping them, and animal spirit into their small, fragile chests. And that, according to this particular strand of the old mythology, is how humanity first came to exist at all, not born from any god's body, not sprung from stone the way Deucalion and Pyrrha's second generation would be after the flood, but shaped, deliberately and by hand, out of river clay, by a Titan who'd apparently taken quite a liking to the project. Zeus, for his part, seems to have regarded the whole endeavor with a kind of distant, faintly proprietary interest, pleased enough, at first, to have a new species populating the world beneath his throne, worshipful subjects who'd burn offerings on altars and remember, at every meal, exactly whose sky they lived under. It's only later, once Prometheus's fondness for his own creation started leading him toward acts of outright defiance, that stolen fire chief among them, that Zeus's affection for humanity curdled into something considerably more guarded. It's worth noticing, if you're keeping track of the whole emotional arc of this family by now, how closely humanity's early relationship with Zeus mirrors his own children's relationship with him. Created, in a sense, almost as an afterthought. Loved, conditionally, so long as the worship kept flowing and the boundaries stayed respected. And punished, swiftly and thoroughly, the moment either one crossed a line he hadn't approved. Prometheus shaped humanity out of love for the project itself. Zeus tolerated humanity out of love for what it could offer him in return. That difference in motive is, in a lot of ways, the entire reason the two of them ended up on opposite sides of a mountain, one of them chained to a rock and the other one holding the eagle's leash. While Zeus was busy settling into married life on Olympus, down on Earth, a rather more fragile experiment was underway. Humanity, a species some accounts say the Titan Prometheus himself had a hand in shaping. Molding the first humans out of clay, while Athene breathed life into them, was struggling. Cold, weak, defenseless against a world that hadn't been built with their comfort particularly in mind. Prometheus, you'll remember, was one of the few Titans who'd sided with Zeus during the war against Cronus, and he had a soft spot for these small, clumsy creatures he'd helped bring into being. He watched them shiver through winters with no fire to warm them, and he decided to do something about it. Zeus, for his part, had decided humanity shouldn't have fire at all. Some accounts frame it as a punishment, others as simple divine possessiveness. Fire belonged to the gods, and Zeus intended to keep it that way, the same way a landlord keeps the good parking spot for himself, even though he never uses it. Prometheus disagreed, loudly and then quietly, and then in a manner that involved theft. He snuck up to Olympus, lit a torch, some versions say from the sun's own chariot, others from the hearth of Hestia herself, hid the flame inside a hollow fennel stalk, and carried it back down to Earth, where he handed humanity the one gift that would let them cook and forge and build, and eventually, over many centuries, become something worth Zeus's attention at all. You give a species fire, you're really giving them everything else too, eventually. Prometheus understood that. Zeus understood it even better, which is exactly why he'd tried to withhold it in the first place. When Zeus found out, his fury was, shall we say, proportionate to the crime as he saw it, which is to say, entirely disproportionate to what most of us would consider a reasonable punishment for handing out warmth. He had Prometheus dragged to a remote mountain, the Caucasus by most accounts, and chained him to the rock with bonds no god or Titan could break. And then came the part of the punishment that stuck with storytellers for 3,000 years, one-liners and all. An eagle, sent by Zeus himself, would arrive each day and eat Prometheus's liver. Because he was immortal, the liver would grow back overnight, fresh and whole. And each morning, the eagle would return and eat it again. Forever, or at least for a very, very long time, some tellings have a hero, generations later, finally freeing him, but that's a story for much further down the road. For now, understand this. Zeus's response to a Titan giving humanity warmth was an eternity of getting eaten alive, one liver at a time, in a cycle designed never to end. If you want the one-line version of Zeus's whole philosophy on defiance, it's roughly this. He didn't punish to teach a lesson. He punished to make sure nobody ever needed the lesson taught twice. But Prometheus wasn't the only one who paid for that stolen fire. Zeus had one more target in mind, and this next punishment landed not on the Titan who stole the flame, but on the entire species who'd received it. If Prometheus got the liver-eating eagle, humanity got something almost worse in the long run, because Zeus's punishment for them wasn't a single moment of pain. It was a permanent condition. He had Hephaestus, the god of the forge, craft a woman out of clay, the first woman by most tellings, since up to this point humanity had apparently gotten along without one, and every god on Olympus was invited to add a gift. Aphrodite gave her beauty. Athene gave her skill in weaving. Hermes gave her a clever silver tongue, and depending on which storyteller you trust least, a tendency toward deception baked right in alongside it. Her name was Pandora, which means roughly all gifted, and she came with exactly one item of luggage, a jar. Some later tellings turned it into a box, which is why you'll hear people talk about Pandora's box instead of Pandora's jar, but the original container was a jar, and inside it Zeus had sealed every evil that could possibly plague mankind. Sickness, toil, grief, old age, every hardship the species hadn't had to deal with before that moment. He sent Pandora down to Earth as a gift to Prometheus's own brother, a rather less clever titan named Epimetheus, whose name fittingly means afterthought or hindsight, the guy who figures things out after it's already too late to matter. Prometheus had warned his brother more than once never to accept gifts from Zeus. Epimetheus, true to his name, accepted anyway and married Pandora without a second thought. And Pandora, being human now, and curious in the specific way that curiosity gets baked into a species, once you've given it fire and free will in the same rough era, eventually opened the jar. Out came everything, every plague, every sorrow, every hardship that had been sealed away, released all at once into a world that had never known any of it before. Pandora slammed the lid back down as fast as she could, but it was already too late. The damage, quite literally, was done, and humanity has been dealing with the consequences ever since. There's one thing left inside the jar when she finally got it shut, though, and depending on who's telling the story, it's either the cruelest detail in the whole myth or the kindest one. The last thing trapped in there, unable to escape along with everything else, was hope. Some storytellers read that as a comfort, no matter how bad it gets, hope remains, permanently available, sealed safely inside where humanity can always reach it. Others read it darker, that hope too was trapped, kept just out of reach. A cruel little joke at the bottom of a jar humanity would spend the rest of its history trying to open all the way. I'll let you decide which version you believe. The Greeks never quite settled it either, and honestly, that's probably the most honest ending a story about hope could ever have. What's not up for debate is the pattern it set. Prometheus gave humanity fire out of love. Zeus answered with an eagle and a jar full of suffering. That's roughly the shape of every argument this king ever has with anyone who challenges him for the rest of the story. Overwhelming retaliation, dressed up as justice, and a punishment that outlasts the crime by several thousand years. Before we go any further into individual love affairs and individual punishments, it's worth stepping back and looking at the much bigger canvas Zeus was working with, because his reign didn't just produce isolated stories. According to the old poet Hesiod, it produced entire ages of humanity, one after another, each one a little further from the gods than the last. The first was the Golden Age, and it belonged, strictly speaking, not even to Zeus, but to his father Cronus, back before the war, back when the Titan king still sat the throne. Humanity in that age lived, by every account, like gods themselves, no work, no sickness, no old age creeping in to spoil things. The earth gave up its fruit freely, without anyone needing to plant a single seed. People simply lived and feasted and died peacefully as if falling asleep, untouched by any of the grief this whole family's story runs so thick with. When the Golden Age finally ended, its people didn't vanish. They became spirits, watching gently over the ages that followed, a kind of quiet, benevolent memory of what humanity once had and slowly, generation by generation, lost. Then came the Silver Age, and this one belonged to Zeus himself, the first age built entirely under his own rule, and it tells you something that even from the very start, his version of humanity came with more friction built into it than his father's had. Children in the Silver Age stayed children for 100 years, coddled and slow to mature, and once they finally did grow up, they lived only a short span afterward, foolish, quarrelsome, and worst of all, in Zeus's eyes, neglectful of the gods. They stopped making sacrifices, stopped honoring the altars that had once meant something. And Zeus, never a king who tolerated being ignored, grew furious enough at their impiety that he wiped the entire age out and started again. If you're noticing a pattern by now, a king building something, growing disappointed in it, and erasing it to start over, you're reading him exactly the way he's meant to be read. That's not incidental. That's the whole rhythm of the man. Next came the Bronze Age, and this one was worse in an entirely different direction. Where the Silver Age had been soft and neglectful, the Bronze Age was hard and violent. An entire generation of humanity forged, quite literally in some tellings, from ash trees, obsessed with war, armed constantly in bronze, from their weapons down to their homes, delighting in conflict for its own sake, until eventually they simply destroyed each other so thoroughly that none of them were left standing at all. Zeus didn't even need to intervene directly this time. He'd built a humanity so devoted to violence that it took care of its own extinction without any help from Olympus whatsoever. Then briefly came the Age of Heroes, not part of the original metal sequence, but inserted by Hesiod because, frankly, the story needed it. This was the age of Heracles, of the Trojan War, of Perseus and Theseus, and every great mortal champion whose name still echoes through this whole family. Nabucco than the Bronze Age that preceded it, though still doomed to violence. Many of its greatest heroes died at Troy or in the wars that followed it. This age at least produced mortals worth remembering for something other than sheer destruction. And finally, the Iron Age, Hesiod's own age, and depending on how cheerful your storyteller happens to be, quite possibly still ours as well. An age of toil and hardship, where children no longer honor their parents, where oaths are broken as easily as they're sworn, where might makes right more often than justice does, and where the gods, increasingly disgusted with what humanity has become, are said to be slowly withdrawing from the world altogether, leaving mortals more and more alone with the consequences of their own choices. It's a bleak note to end that particular tale on, and Hesiod himself wasn't shy about how bleak he intended it. But notice something about the whole progression, because it says as much about Zeus as it does about humanity. Every single age, golden to iron, happened under divine order he presided over, shaped, and more than once deliberately ended when it stopped pleasing him. Kings write history by living through it. This king wrote history by periodically erasing entire ages of it and starting fresh. The same instinct that had once made him rescue his own siblings from a father's stomach, and would later make him drown nearly all of humanity in a single flood. Building, judging, erasing, building again. That's not just Zeus's parenting style, or his approach to romance, or his method of handling rebellious titans. It's the whole shape of his reign, laid out across the entire history of the world he ruled. Humanity, freshly acquainted with sickness and toil and grief thanks to that jar, didn't get any nicer as the generations rolled on. and Zeus, who liked to check in on his creation now and then, usually disguised as a mortal himself, wandering the earth incognito to see how his subjects were behaving when they didn't know a god was watching, eventually ran into a king who would test even his considerable patience. His name was Lycaon, king of Arcadia, and when word reached him that a stranger claiming to be Zeus himself had come wandering through his lands, Lycaon decided the best way to test that claim was, "And I want you to sit with this one," to murder one of his own sons, cook the body, and serve it to his guest as dinner. The logic, such as it was, ran something like, if this stranger really is a god, he'll know what's on the plate before he takes a bite. If he's not, well, no harm done to a mere mortal who ate what he was served. It's one of the darker little tests in the whole mythology, and Zeus, who, whatever else you want to say about him, was not fooled for even a second, knew exactly what had been put in front of him. He didn't wait around to see if Lycaon would confess. He flipped the table, quite literally by some tellings, and turned Lycaon into a wolf on the spot. Fitting punishment, if you think about it, a man who'd behaved like an animal, stripped of his human shape entirely and left to wander the world as the very thing his own cruelty had already made him. It's where we get the word lycanthrope, if you're keeping track of the etymology. Every werewolf story you've ever heard owes something to one very bad dinner party on a mountain in Arcadia. But Lycaon's crime shook Zeus more than any single act of cruelty should have, because it wasn't really about one bad king. It was a symptom. Zeus looked around at the whole of humanity and saw, or believed he saw, a species that had curdled, violent, deceitful, forgetting every debt they owed the gods who'd shaped and warmed and armed them. And a king with a thunderbolt, faced with a world he'd decided had gone rotten, doesn't usually reach for half measures. He decided to wipe it all out and start again. A flood, vast enough to cover the earth entirely, sent down to drown every trace of the species that had disappointed him. And it very nearly worked. Nearly every human being alive at the time died in those waters, an extinction event on a scale that makes Lycaon's dinner party look almost quaint by comparison. Almost everyone, because Prometheus, still chained to his rock, still losing his liver to that eagle every single day, and still, evidently, capable of caring what happened to the species he'd helped create, warned his own son, a man named Deucalion, that the flood was coming. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha built an ark, rode out the deluge, and washed ashore once the waters finally receded, as the last two human beings left alive in the entire world. They were told by an oracle to throw the bones of their mother behind them as they walked. It's the kind of instruction that sounds monstrous until you work out the riddle. Their mother, in the broadest possible sense, was the earth itself, and her bones were stones. So Deucalion and Pyrrha walked forward, throwing stones over their shoulders as they went, and every stone Deucalion threw became a man. Every stone Pyrrha threw became a woman. That's how humanity started over, not from a garden this time, from two survivors and a riddle about rocks. You'd think, having wiped out nearly the entire species once already, Zeus might have learned to keep a little more distance from the world he'd remade. He did not learn that lesson. If anything, what came next only proved he'd developed an even greater interest in wandering down among the very mortals he'd just come within an inch of erasing entirely. Here's a truth about Zeus that the whole rest of his life bears out, again and again, in ways both magnificent and deeply uncomfortable. He fell for mortals constantly, endlessly, with a consistency that makes you wonder how he ever found time to run a universe. And every single time, he had to get creative about how he approached them, because gods appearing in their full glory tend to be, quite literally, too much for a mortal body to survive. So he shapeshifted, constantly, and the first of the great transformations belongs to a princess named Europa. She was the daughter of a king in Phoenicia, out one day gathering flowers by the shore with her attendants, when a bull wandered down to the beach and lay in the sand near her. Not an ordinary bull, pure white, coat gleaming, gentle enough that Europa, curious, walked right up and began decorating its horns with the flowers she'd been picking. Eventually, feeling bold, she climbed onto its back. That was, of course, exactly what the bull had been waiting for. The moment she was settled, the animal rose and walked straight into the sea, carrying her off the shore and out across open water, and by the time Europa understood what was happening, she was already too far from land to do anything but hold on. The bull swam all the way to the island of Crete, the very island, incidentally, where baby Zeus had once been hidden from his own father, and only there, once they'd arrived, did the bull reveal himself for what he truly was. Europa became queen of Crete and mother to several children by Zeus, including a son named Minos, who would go on to be famous in his own right, the same king whose reign gave us the labyrinth and the Minotaur and a whole tangle of later myths that don't concern us tonight. But her name lives on in something far bigger than a single kingdom. An entire continent carries it. Every time someone says Europe, they're saying the name of a princess who once decorated a bull's horns with flowers and had absolutely no idea what she was climbing onto. That's the thing about Zeus's disguises, if you want the one-liner for it. No creature was ever just a creature. Every swan had a motive. Every bull had an itinerary. Not every transformation was quite so grand in scale, either. Sometimes it was a shower of gold, sneaking through a locked tower where a king had imprisoned his own daughter to keep a prophecy from coming true. Sometimes it was a swan, drifting across a quiet lake toward a queen bathing at the water's edge. Sometimes it was nothing more exotic than the shape of a woman's own husband, walking through her front door while the real husband was away at war, which is, when you actually think about it, probably the single most dishonest disguise of the entire lot. Not a bull, not gold, not a bird. Just a lie wearing a familiar face. We'll get to each of those in turn, but first, we need to talk about the queen up on Olympus. Watching every single one of these affairs unfold from a considerable distance, and getting angrier with each new report that reached her. There's more to Europa's story than the bull and the swim to Crete, and it's worth following her son Minos a little further too, because his reign shows you a side of Zeus's fatherhood you haven't quite seen yet tonight, the lawgiver rather than the seducer. Minos grew up to rule Crete, and by most accounts, he ruled it well, wisely, firmly, with a sense of justice sharp enough that later Greeks credited the very laws of the island to conversations Minos supposedly held with his own father once every 9 years, retreating to a sacred cave to receive fresh divine guidance on how a kingdom ought to be run. Whether or not those meetings happened exactly as described, the reputation stuck. Minos, son of a god, ruling with laws so respected that even the underworld itself eventually put him to work. After his death, he became one of the 3 judges of the dead, alongside Aeacus, Aegena's own son, whom you've already heard about tonight, weighing the deeds of every soul that passed through the underworld's gates for the rest of eternity. But Minos's reign wasn't without its own share of this family's usual chaos, and the most famous of it involves a bull, a curse, and a monster that still lends its name to mazes and labyrinths to this very day. Minos, in a dispute over his own claim to the throne, once prayed to Poseidon for a sign, asking the sea god to send up a magnificent bull from the ocean as proof of his right to rule, promising to sacrifice the creature back to Poseidon once it had served its purpose. Poseidon obliged, sending up a bull so beautiful that Minos, once he had it, couldn't bring himself to follow through on the sacrifice. He kept the bull for himself and offered up a lesser animal in its place, hoping the sea god wouldn't notice the substitution. Poseidon noticed. In punishment, he cursed Minos's own wife, Pasiphae, with an unnatural passion for the very bull her husband had refused to sacrifice, and from that union came the Minotaur, half man, half bull, a monster born from one king's broken promise to a god who wasn't Zeus at all, but whose fury still ended up shaping the fate of Zeus's own grandson's household for a generation. Minos, horrified and ashamed, had the great craftsman Daedalus build a labyrinth beneath his palace to contain the creature, and for years afterward demanded tribute from conquered Athens, youths and maidens, sent regularly into that maze to be devoured, until a hero named Theseus finally ended the cycle by slaying the Minotaur himself, guided out of the labyrinth by a thread given to him by Minos's own daughter, Ariadne. It's a strange little wrinkle in Zeus's own family story, worth noting precisely because Zeus himself plays almost no direct role in it. He fathered Minos through Europa, gave the island a wise and lasting body of law through that same bloodline, and then simply watched from a distance as his own grandson's household spiraled into one of the darkest, strangest tragedies in the entire mythology, proof that even a lineage this powerful, this favored, wasn't immune to consequences that had nothing to do with Zeus's own choices at all. Sometimes the chaos in this family doesn't come from the king on Olympus. Sometimes it just runs downhill anyway, gathering speed, long after he's stopped watching closely enough to catch it. Let's take the shower of gold first, because it's got one of the better setups in the whole catalogue. There was a king named Acrisius, ruler of Argos, who received a prophecy that ought to sound familiar by now, given everything you've already heard about this family. His own daughter's son would one day grow up and kill him. Faced with that news, Acrisius did what every king in this family seems to do when confronted with an unwanted prophecy. He panicked badly and made a decision that was cruel enough to feel effective and stupid enough to guarantee it wouldn't work. He locked his daughter, Danae, in a bronze chamber, sealed off from the world entirely, sunk partly underground, with no way in or out, and crucially, though he apparently never quite thought this part through, a small opening in the roof for air and light. You can guess where this is going. Zeus saw Danae down there, isolated and radiant despite her imprisonment, and where a locked bronze room might have stopped an ordinary suitor, it posed no real obstacle to a god who could simply become something that didn't need a door. He transformed into a shower of golden light, poured down through that opening in the roof, and reached her exactly the way water reaches the bottom of a well, inevitably, and without asking permission from whatever's trying to keep it out. Danae bore a son, Perseus, who would grow up to become one of the great heroes of the whole mythology, the one who eventually beheaded the Gorgon Medusa, and in a plot twist that would have made his grandfather's blood run cold if he'd been paying closer attention to old prophecies, did indeed end up responsible for Acrisius's death many years later, not through malice, as it happens, but through a genuinely tragic accident with a discus at a set of athletic games. Prophecies in this family have a funny way of coming true regardless of how hard anyone tries to dodge them. You can lock your daughter in a bronze room. You cannot lock out a god who's already decided to become the light coming through your roof. Since we're already standing in Danae's story, it's worth following her son a little further, because Perseus turned out to be one of the finest examples in everything you've heard tonight of what a grandson of Zeus could actually accomplish once he grew into himself. He was still young when a king named Polydectes, who'd taken an unwanted interest in Danae and wanted her son safely out of the way, sent Perseus on what he assumed would be a fatal errand: bring back the head of Medusa, a Gorgon so monstrous that a single glance at her face turned any living thing to stone. It was, as far as Polydectes was concerned, a polite way of arranging a death without getting his own hands dirty. Perseus, being Zeus's own blood, had rather more help available to him than Polydectes had bargained for. Athene and Hermes, both fond of this particular grandson, outfitted him for the task like a divine quartermaster team, a polished shield from Athene, reflective enough to let him view Medusa's reflection instead of her face directly, and Hermes lent him a curved blade sharp enough to do the job in a single stroke. Winged sandals came next, borrowed from nymphs who'd been given directions to help him by Hermes himself, along with a cap of invisibility on loan from Hades. The same helm, in fact, that Hades himself had once received from the Cyclopes back at the very start of this whole tangled family. Kitted out like that, Perseus found Medusa's lair, approached her using nothing but her reflection in that polished shield, and took her head in one clean stroke while she slept, careful never once to look at her directly. From her severed neck sprang a winged horse, Pegasus, born in that single strange, violent instant, product of an earlier union between Medusa and Poseidon that nobody had quite finished processing until her death finally let it out into the world. Perseus's adventures on the way home only piled up from there. He came across a princess named Andromeda, chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster sent to punish her mother's own boastfulness. A story that rhymes rather uncomfortably with Niobe's, if you're paying attention to how often this whole reign punishes mothers for pride by threatening their children. Perseus killed the monster, freed Andromeda, and married her on the spot, because that's simply the pace at which heroes in this whole family's history tend to move. He eventually returned home, turned the treacherous Polydex to stone with Medusa's severed head, still fully capable of the very power that had killed her, even separated from her body, and went on, years later, to fulfill the very prophecy his grandfather Acrisius had spent a lifetime trying to dodge, killing the old king by accident with an errant discus throw at a set of athletic games neither of them had any reason to expect would turn fatal. It's a heroic story through and through, cleaner and less tangled with cruelty than most of what you've heard tonight, and it's worth remembering as a kind of counterweight to everything else. For every Callisto turned into a bear and hunted by her own son, for every Io chased across the world by a stinging fly. There's a Perseus, a child of one of Zeus's affairs who grew up loved, equipped, and genuinely capable, using the gifts his bloodline gave him to do something worth remembering long after the god who fathered him had gone quiet. Not every consequence of Zeus's wandering eye ended in tragedy. Some of them ended up riding a winged horse into legend instead. Now back to the swan, because it's arguably the most famous transformation of the whole lot, and it produced one of the most consequential children in the entire history of Greek myth. There was a queen, Leda, wife of a Spartan king, bathing by a quiet lake, when a swan drifted toward her, beautiful, graceful, seemingly fleeing some unseen pursuer, and Leda, moved to protect the poor creature, drew it in against her. You already know how this goes by now. The swan was Zeus. What happened next gets tangled up across different versions of the myth in ways that don't fully agree with each other, and honestly, I think that's fitting, because the results themselves were tangled too. Leda, by some accounts, laid eggs, actual eggs, and from them hatched children who belonged, in ways nobody could quite sort out, partly to Zeus and partly to her mortal husband, all raised together under the same roof, brothers and sisters who weren't entirely sure which of them shared a father with which. Among those children was a daughter who would grow up to become the most famous woman in the ancient world. Her name was Helen. Yes, that Helen, the face that, depending on which poet you ask, either launched 1,000 ships or simply got blamed for a war that several kings had been looking for an excuse to start anyway. Her origin, a swan on a quiet lake, a queen who thought she was rescuing something fragile, sits underneath the entire Trojan War like a foundation nobody, in that later story, ever bothers to look down and check. That's the strange gravity of this family. A king seduces a queen in the shape of a bird by a lake, and a decade later, an entire civilization burns because of the daughter that union produced. Zeus's affairs were never really contained to just the people they happened to. The ripples went out for generations, and sometimes for entire wars. Now let's talk about Io, because if you want to understand exactly how far Hera's jealousy could reach once it got going, this is the story that shows you. Io was a priestess, serving in Hera's own temple no less, which tells you something about how little Zeus concerned himself with the irony of the situations he wandered into. And when Zeus fell for her, he tried, for once, to get ahead of the problem before his wife found out. He wrapped the whole region in a thick, unnatural cloud, hoping to hide the affair from Olympus entirely. Hera noticed the cloud immediately. A queen who's caught her husband this many times develops an instinct for exactly this kind of suspicious weather, and she came down to investigate in person. Zeus, cornered, did the only thing he could think to do in the moment. He turned Io into a cow, a perfectly ordinary-looking heifer, standing in a field, nothing at all to see here, dear, just checking on the local livestock. Hera, who was nobody's fool despite everything her husband seemed to assume about her, looked at this suspiciously well-timed cow, and rather than let the matter drop, asked for it as a gift, just to see what her husband would do. And Zeus, trapped by his own lie, had no real way to refuse without confirming exactly what Hera already suspected. He gave her the cow. What followed was, by any measure, one of the crueler turns in everything you've heard tonight of cruelty. Hera set a guardian over the transformed Io, a giant named Argus, covered, depending on the telling, in anywhere from 100 eyes to enough eyes that he genuinely never needed to sleep with all of them closed at once. A handful could always stay open, watching, while the rest rested. There was no slipping past a guard like that, no moment of inattention to exploit. Zeus, unwilling to simply abandon the woman he'd doomed to this fate, sent Hermes down to deal with it, and Hermes, ever the clever one, didn't try to fight his way past 100 watching eyes. He talked his way past them instead. Disguised as a shepherd, he sat with Argus, told him story after story, played him music on a set of pipes, on and on, patiently, until finally, one by one, all those eyes grew heavy and closed. Every single one. And once the last eye finally shut, Hermes cut off Argus's head, and Io, still trapped in her cow's body, was free of her guard at last. Hera, discovering what had happened to her 100-eyed servant, didn't simply let the matter drop. She took Argus's eyes, every one of them, and scattered them across the tail feathers of her sacred bird, the peacock, which is why, to this day, a peacock's tail looks the way it does. Next time you see one spread its feathers, you're looking at the eyes of a giant who died doing his job a little too well for a queen who never forgot a debt owed. But Hera wasn't finished with Io herself, either. She sent a gadfly to torment the poor transformed woman relentlessly, stinging her again and again, driving her half-mad across the known world in an endless, desperate flight from one country to the next, with no relief and no end in sight. It took Zeus, eventually, swearing off any further contact with Io entirely, a promise to Hera, made under considerable pressure, before the torment finally stopped, and Io was allowed to return to her own shape. She settled in Egypt, by most accounts, and bore Zeus a son there, the last quiet chapter of a story that had begun with a cloud and a very suspicious cow. Here's the pattern, laid bare, and it's worth remembering because it repeats. Zeus does the wandering, Hera does the punishing, and the person caught in between, nearly always a woman with no say in any of it, pays for a decision that was never really hers to begin with. That's not a flattering thing to say about the king of the gods, but I promised you the whole story, and this is the whole story, so we're not going to pretend otherwise as we go. There's a small, quiet postscript to Io's ordeal worth adding before we move on, if only because it's one of the rare instances where a story this cruel leaves something lasting behind besides grief. The son she bore Zeus once she'd finally settled in Egypt was named Epaphus, and he grew up to found a great city there, becoming, by several ancient accounts, the mortal figure some later writers associated with the founding of Memphis itself, one of the oldest and most storied cities in the whole of the ancient world. His own descendants, generations down the line, produced a set of 50 sisters called the Danaids, whose own story is dark enough to fill a whole night's telling on its own, and who eventually made their way back across the sea to found the very city of Argos, tying a bloodline that began with a stolen priestess turned into a cow all the way back into the heart of mainland Greece. It doesn't undo what Hera did to her. Nothing could. But it's worth knowing that Io's suffering didn't simply end with her restoration and disappear from the story. It rippled outward for generations, the way nearly everything in this family does, eventually helping to found cities that stood for thousands of years after the woman who started that whole bloodline had been forgotten by everyone except the storytellers still bothering to trace the thread all the way back. If Io's story shows you the shape of Hera's revenge, Semele's story shows you exactly how far she was willing to go to make it fatal. Semele was a mortal princess of Thebes, and Zeus fell for her the way he fell for nearly everyone in this part of the story, completely, quickly, and with very little thought for the consequences that tended to follow. He visited her in secret for a while, and Semele, pregnant now with his child, found herself the target of a very particular kind of visitor. Hera, disguised as an old nurse, a trusted friend, someone Semele had no reason at all to suspect. Hera, in that disguise, planted a single seed of doubt, the way she always did best. "How do you know," she asked, "that your lover really is Zeus at all? Men lie about that sort of thing constantly. Why not ask him to prove it? Ask him to appear before you in his true divine form, the way he would for his own wife. If he loves you the way he claims, he won't refuse." It's a cruel little trap, dressed up as reasonable advice, and Semele, young, in love, and with no idea she was being handled by the very goddess most invested in her downfall, took the bait completely. She asked Zeus to grant her one wish, and made him swear on the river Styx before she'd tell him what it was, an oath so binding that not even the king of the gods could break it once it was sworn, no matter what came after. Zeus agreed, the way you agree to anything when you're in love and haven't yet heard the terms. Then Semele asked to see him in his true form. Zeus knew immediately what this meant and knew there was no way out of it. He'd sworn on the Styx. A god's true form, the full, unfiltered reality of his divine power, thunder and lightning and majesty on a scale no mortal body was ever built to survive, was fatal to look upon directly, and he begged her, pleaded with her, to take back the wish. She wouldn't, or couldn't, having already been so thoroughly convinced by Hera's careful planting that a refusal now would only prove her worst fear correct. So Zeus appeared before her as himself, and Semele, mortal and unprepared, was consumed instantly by the sheer force of it, burned to nothing in the presence of the very god who loved her, killed by an oath he was bound to keep, and a trick he never saw coming until it was already too late to stop. But the story doesn't end there, because Semele was pregnant, and Zeus, even in the wreckage of that moment, moved fast enough to save the child. He snatched the unborn baby from Semele's body and sewed it into his own thigh, carrying it there himself until it was ready to be born. Some months later, from Zeus's own leg, a fully formed god stepped into the world. His name was Dionysus, god of wine, of festivity, of the wild, ecstatic release that comes from letting go of every careful, controlled thing a person usually holds on to. Twice born, they called him. Once from a mortal mother who never survived to see him take his first breath, and once from his own father's body, which is not, by any measure, a normal way to enter the world, even by the standards of this particular family. Hera, having engineered the death of Semele so thoroughly, spent years afterwards still hunting Dionysus, still trying to finish what her manipulation had started. And Dionysus, for his part, grew up to become one of the most beloved gods on the entire mountain, the one who understood better than any of his siblings what it meant to lose everything and still find a reason to celebrate. That's the whole tangled shape of this family, laid out in a single story. A god's careless love, a queen's calculated cruelty, and a child born twice over out of both, who somehow still turned out to be the god of joy. If Hera's cruelty toward Io feels sustained, and her cruelty toward Semele feels calculated, wait until you hear what she had in store for the son of Alcmene, because this is the one that follows a child literally from before his birth all the way to the very end of his mortal life, and it doesn't let up once, not for a single chapter of it. Alcmene was a mortal woman, married to a general named Amphitryon, and about as devoted a wife as you'll find anywhere in this whole family, which, as it turns out, is exactly the quality Zeus decided to exploit. While Amphitryon was away at war, Zeus disguised himself as the general himself, walked into Alcmene's home wearing her own husband's face, and spent the night with her under a lie so complete that Alcmene had absolutely no idea she'd been deceived at all. Some tellings even have Zeus stretching that single night out to the length of 3, ordering the sun itself not to rise, simply because he wasn't ready for the deception to end. Whatever else you want to say about this king, and there is quite a lot to say by this point in the story, that particular disguise, not a bull, not a swan, not gold, but the actual face of a woman's own husband, is about as dishonest as seduction gets. Amphitryon returned the next day, and Alcmene, confused about why her husband seemed to be describing a night that had, from her side, already happened, eventually pieced together at least part of the truth. She was pregnant, as it turned out, with twins, one son fathered by Zeus, one by her actual husband, conceived within the same short span of time. It happens more than you'd think in a family this complicated. Zeus, watching from Olympus, was thrilled. He announced to the whole court that the child about to be born into the line of Perseus that very day would grow up to rule over all his kinsmen, a proud father, getting ahead of himself the way proud fathers tend to, boasting about a son who hadn't even drawn breath yet. Hera heard that boast and moved instantly. She knew of another pregnant woman in that same bloodline, closer to her due date, and Hera, goddess of childbirth herself, with real power over exactly this kind of timing, delayed Alcmene's labor while speeding up the other woman's, ensuring that a different child, a boy named Eurystheus, was born first and technically qualified for the destiny Zeus had just promised out loud to the whole of Olympus. That's Hera for you in one perfect, vicious move. Not a curse, not a monster, just a very precise manipulation of timing engineered to make sure her husband's own boast backfired on the exact child he'd meant to bless. When Alcmene's son was finally born, they named him Heracles, meaning, with an irony that must have made Hera absolutely furious every time she heard it, glory of Hera. Alcmene, terrified of what the queen of the gods might do to a child born from her husband's affair, tried to leave the infant exposed outside the city, hoping to spare him the worst of Hera's wrath before it ever found him. Athene found him first, brought him, without saying who he really was, to Hera herself, and convinced the unsuspecting queen to nurse the abandoned baby at her own breast. Heracles suckled so powerfully that Hera, startled and in some pain, pulled him away, and the story goes that some of her divine milk sprayed across the night sky in that moment, and that spill of milk is the very thing we still call the Milky Way today. Once Hera realized whose child she just nursed, her fury only deepened. She sent 2 serpents into his crib that same night to finish what her timing trick had failed to prevent, and baby Heracles, already showing the strength that would define his entire life, simply grabbed one snake in each fist and strangled them both before anyone else in the household even knew there was danger in the room. That was only the beginning. Hera would go on to torment Heracles for the whole of his mortal life, driving him, in one especially dark chapter we'll come back to later, into a fit of madness that led him to kill his own wife and children, an act of horror that was never really his own choice, but hers, engineered from start to finish. It was in atonement for that very tragedy that Heracles undertook his famous 12 labors, a penance for a crime his father's wife had essentially forced him to commit. Zeus, through all of it, mostly just watched. He loved Heracles, was proud of him, defended him where he could, and eventually welcomed him to Olympus itself as a full god once his mortal trials were finally over. But he never once managed, or perhaps never once truly tried, to stop Hera's campaign against him while it was actually happening. That's the closest thing to a defining trait Zeus has, if you're keeping score by now. Tremendous power, used generously to punish his enemies, and used remarkably little to protect the people his own choices put in danger. Here's a thread that ties directly back into the war we've already spent so much time on tonight, and it starts, like so many of these stories, with a nymph named Electra, not to be confused with the far more famous mortal Electra from a much later tragedy, just one of the many women across everything you've heard tonight who happen to share a name with someone else's more famous story. This Electra was one of the 7 Pleiades, sisters to Maia, whom you'll remember bore Zeus his trickster son Hermes. Zeus fell for Electra as well in that same general era, and she bore him a son named Dardanus, who grew up to become a wandering king, eventually settling in a region of Asia Minor and founding a city that would carry his family's name down through the generations, Dardania, and the people who lived there, the Dardanians, a name that shows up again and again once you get to the Trojan War, since it's simply another name for the very people Troy ruled over. Dardanus's line continued down through his descendants until, generations later, it produced a king named Tros, who gave his own name to the city and its people in turn, Troy, Trojans, all tracing back through an unbroken royal bloodline to a nymph and a god from centuries before the war that would eventually destroy the city bearing their family's name. And Tros, as it happens, was also the father of a young prince you've already heard about tonight, carried off by an eagle to become cupbearer of the gods. Ganymede was Dardanus's own great-grandson, which means that when Zeus swept that beautiful young shepherd up to Olympus, he was, in a sense, simply reclaiming a piece of his own bloodline, reaching back down into a family he'd founded generations earlier, and pulling one more descendant up to live among the gods. It's worth sitting with the strange symmetry of that, because it runs through nearly this entire war. Troy's own royal line begins with Zeus's affair with a nymph. Troy's most beautiful prince gets taken up to Olympus by that same god, generations later. And when the war finally comes, when Greek and Trojan armies spend 10 years tearing each other apart over Helen, over pride, over an apple thrown at a wedding, Zeus isn't watching from some distant, disinterested height. He's watching a city that carries his own bloodline burned to the ground, weighing the fates of soldiers who are, however many generations removed, quite literally his own family. That's the thing about a king who fathered as many bloodlines as Zeus did, across as many kingdoms as this whole family reaches. Sooner or later, nearly every war becomes, in some small and inescapable way, a family matter. For as many stories as this whole night has told about Hera's fury landing on everyone except her husband, there's one notable exception worth telling in full, because it shows you that even a queen who terrorized nymphs and mortal women across the entire known world eventually found the one line even she couldn't cross without consequence. It happened during a storm Zeus once raised against Heracles' ship, sending him wildly off course during one of his voyages, a fairly typical entry in Hera's long, sustained campaign against her husband's son. But this particular storm, it turned out, crossed a line Zeus hadn't authorized. Hera had gone behind his back entirely, whipping up the winds herself without her husband's knowledge or approval, nearly drowning Heracles at sea in a scheme that, for once, Zeus hadn't sanctioned. When he found out, Zeus's fury matched anything he'd ever directed at a rebellious titan or a defiant mortal king. He seized Hera and bound her, wrists chained, with two heavy golden anvils tied to her ankles, and suspended her like that from the sky itself, hung out in open space where every other god on Olympus could see exactly what happened to a queen who overstepped her husband's authority. The other gods, watching their queen dangling in chains, were horrified enough that several of them tried to intervene on her behalf, and Zeus, in response, made an example of the ones who tried. He hurled Hephaestus bodily off Olympus for attempting to free his mother, a fall so violent it's the very injury some tellings point to as the reason Hephaestus limped for the rest of his existence, lame in one leg from a father's fury at a son's attempt at mercy. Hera hung there, by most accounts, for the better part of a full day and night, until finally the other gods pleaded with Zeus enough and swore oaths on his behalf that he agreed to release her, but only once she'd sworn her own oath in return, promising never again to raise a storm or a scheme against Heracles without her husband's direct knowledge and consent. It's a jarring story to hear this late into the telling, because for the whole rest of this list, it's Hera doing the punishing and mortal women paying the price. Here, for once, the punisher becomes the punished, and the scene that follows, a queen suspended in chains, a son cast down from Olympus for trying to help her, makes for uncomfortable listening no matter which direction the cruelty happens to be pointing. I tell it not to balance some kind of scale, because there's no balancing what happened to Io, or Semele, or Callisto, or any of the other women scattered across this whole tangled family. I tell it because it's honest about the actual structure of this family. Power flowed downward, always from Zeus to everyone else, and even his own wife, Queen of Olympus, goddess of marriage itself, found out, on that particular day, exactly how far down everyone else could reach when her husband decided she'd stepped out of line. That's the throne this whole family sat around, dinner after dinner, century after century. Nobody at that table, not even the queen beside him, was ever entirely safe from the king at its head. Not every one of Zeus's great loves was a woman, and the story of Ganymede is worth telling in full, because it's one of the few in everything you've heard tonight that doesn't end in tragedy for the person he pursued. Ganymede was a mortal prince of Troy, a city that will, generations later, become considerably more important to this whole family's story, and by every account, the most beautiful young man in the entire world. Zeus, spotting him one afternoon tending sheep on a hillside, was struck the way he was always struck, instantly, completely, and with an immediate plan already forming for how to have him. He transformed into an eagle, his own sacred bird, the one that still, to this day, carries his thunderbolts in every statue and every coin that bothers to depict him properly, and swept down out of the sky, snatching Ganymede straight up off that hillside and carrying him bodily up to Olympus. Once there, Zeus made him the cupbearer of the gods, a position of genuine honor, pouring nectar for the entire divine court at every feast, and by most accounts granted him immortality outright, so the beauty that had first caught a god's eye would never fade the way mortal beauty always, eventually, does. Hera, predictably, wasn't thrilled about a new permanent resident on Olympus, who existed entirely because of her husband's wandering attention. But this affair, unlike so many others, never seems to have drawn out her full fury the way the mortal women did, perhaps because Ganymede posed no threat to her own status the way a rival queen or a promising son might have, or perhaps simply because some of these old stories were kinder to some people than others, for reasons that don't always survive down to us. Zeus, for his part, placed Ganymede's memory permanently in the sky once his story was told and retold enough times to matter. The constellation Aquarius, the water-bearer, still pouring out an eternal cup for anyone who looks up and knows where to find it. It's one of the gentler entries in this whole long list, and I think it's worth pausing on for exactly that reason. Not every story about this king ends in ruin, just most of them. The story of Leto is short, but it's brutal in exactly the way Hera's punishments always were, not aimed at Zeus, never at Zeus, but at the woman carrying his child, and this time at the child too, before it was even born. Leto was a titaness, and when she became pregnant by Zeus, Hera decreed that no land anywhere on earth, no solid ground of any kind, floating or fixed, would be allowed to offer her shelter to give birth. Every place Leto turned, the earth itself, terrified of Hera's wrath, refused to let her rest. She wandered like that for what must have felt like an eternity, turned away again and again, growing heavier and more desperate with every refusal, until finally she came upon a small floating island called Delos, a scrap of land that wasn't technically fixed to the seabed at all, and so, by the strict letter of Hera's decree, didn't quite count as forbidden ground. Delos, out of pity, agreed to let her stay. Even then, Hera wasn't finished. She kept the goddess of childbirth herself, Eileithyia, away from the island for 9 full days and nights, refusing to let her attend the birth, drawing out Leto's labor in agony for as long as she possibly could. Finally, the other gods managed to bribe Eileithyia into coming anyway, and Leto gave birth first to a daughter, Artemis, who was born with so little trouble that she was able to turn around and help deliver her own twin brother moments later. Apollo came next, god of the sun, of music, of prophecy, born on a floating island because no other ground in the whole world had been brave enough to risk Hera's fury. Both children grew into 2 of the most powerful gods on the entire mountain, Artemis, fierce protector of the wild and of women in childbirth, remembering exactly what her own mother went through to bring her into the world. Apollo, radiant and gifted, patron of every art that requires precision and light in equal measure. And that floating island, once forbidden to every mother turned away by fear of a jealous queen, became sacred ground from that day forward, fixed permanently in place. Some tellings say, as a reward for its courage, no longer drifting, no longer needing to hide. It's a small mercy, buried in a story that's mostly cruelty, but it's there if you look for it. Somewhere in every one of these tales, there's usually one person or one island who decided the risk was worth taking anyway. Callisto's story is short too, and it might be the cruelest one yet, because it comes with a twist of betrayal from a direction the poor woman never saw coming. She was a nymph, sworn to chastity as one of Artemis's own devoted companions, hunting through the wild forests with a vow of celibacy she took as seriously as anything in her whole life. Zeus, spotting her among Artemis's followers, wanted her anyway, and knowing full well she'd never willingly break her vow for a stranger, disguised himself as Artemis herself to get close enough. Callisto, believing she was simply spending time with the goddess she served and trusted above all others, had no reason at all to be on guard. By the time she understood what had actually happened, it was already far too late. She became pregnant and tried, understandably, to hide it, vows of chastity being rather difficult to explain away otherwise. But Artemis, the real one this time, eventually discovered the truth while the group was bathing together, and expelled Callisto from her company entirely, furious at what she believed was a broken promise, with apparently very little interest in the fact that Callisto had never actually chosen any of it. Hera, hearing of the pregnancy, delivered her own punishment on top of that abandonment. She transformed Callisto into a bear, condemning her to wander the forests in that shape for years, hunted by the very hunters she'd once run alongside as a woman. Callisto gave birth to a son, Arcas, who grew up among mortals with no idea his own mother had been turned into an animal roaming the very woods he hunted in. Years later, grown into a skilled hunter himself, Arcas came across a bear in the forest, his own transformed mother, still trapped in that shape, recognizing her son even though he couldn't possibly recognize her, and raised his spear to kill it, with absolutely no idea what he was about to do. Zeus, watching from Olympus, and finally, belatedly, intervening in a fate his own actions had set in motion in the first place, stopped the killing blow just in time. He swept both mother and son up into the sky together, transforming them into constellations. Callisto became Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and Arcas became Ursa Minor, the Little Bear, fixed together in the night sky forever, close enough to always be near each other, even if neither of them could ever fully return to who they'd been before. Hera, even then, wasn't quite finished. She went to the sea god Poseidon and asked one final favor, that this particular set of constellations never be allowed to set below the horizon, never granted the simple mortal comfort of dipping into the ocean to rest the way every other constellation eventually does. And if you've ever noticed that the Great Bear and Little Bear seem to circle endlessly around the North Star without ever quite disappearing from the sky, well, now you know whose grudge is still, in a sense, keeping them awake. That's 4 stories in a row now where Hera's punishment lands entirely on a woman with no real say in what happened to her, and I want to be honest with you about that pattern rather than smooth it over, because it's not an accident of storytelling. It's the actual shape of this king's story: immense power, immense appetite, and a trail of consequences that almost never land on the one person responsible for starting them. Not every threat to Zeus's throne came from a titan or a jealous rival god. Some of it came from mortals with entirely too much ambition and access to entirely too many mountains. And the story of Otus and Ephialtes is exactly that kind of tale, equal parts terrifying and, in hindsight, almost a little bit funny. They were twin giants, sons of Poseidon by most tellings, known collectively as the Elodi, and they grew at a rate that alarmed everyone who heard about it, 9 fingers wider and 9 feet taller every single year, according to the old account, which means that by the time they reached young adulthood, they were already large enough to make most of the monsters you've already met look modest by comparison. And what did 2 enormous, rapidly growing twin giants decide to do with all that size and strength? They decided to storm heaven itself. Not metaphorically, they made an actual literal plan to reach Olympus by stacking mountains on top of one another like children building with blocks, piling Mount Ossa on top of Mount Pelion, intending to climb that towering, improvised staircase straight up to the god's own front door and take the throne by force. It's worth pausing on the sheer audacity of that plan for a second, because it's one of the boldest, most straightforwardly ambitious schemes in this whole reign. Forget tricking a titan with a rock disguised as a baby. Forget sneaking into a locked bronze tower as a shower of gold. These 2 just looked at the literal geography of the world and decided the answer to how do we overthrow the king of the gods was simply bigger mountain. They didn't stop at the plan, either. According to some tellings, they went so far as to threaten to fill in the sea with mountains and flood the land with the ocean that used to fill it, rearranging the entire physical world if that's what it took to get their way, and they reportedly held Ares himself captive for over a year at one point, locking the god of war in a bronze jar simply because they could. Zeus, watching 2 overgrown mortal twins seriously attempt to rearrange the geography of the entire earth in order to reach his throne, did not take the threat lightly, whatever grim amusement the plan might have offered him at first. In most versions of the story, it's Artemis who finally ends the threat, appearing to the twins in the shape of a deer, running between them at just the right angle that, in their eagerness to strike her down together, they ended up hurling their spears straight through each other instead, killing themselves with their own combined ambition rather than ever needing a thunderbolt to finish the job. It's a fitting kind of end, if you think about it. Two brothers who tried to stack the whole world on top of itself just to reach a throne that was never going to be theirs, finally undone not by the gods they meant to overthrow, but by their own competing eagerness to land the killing blow first. Ambition, in this whole family's history, rarely needs outside help to collapse. Give it enough mountains to stack, and it usually finds a way to bring itself down on its own. Let's shift gears for a moment, because Zeus wasn't only a husband chasing across the countryside in various animal disguises. He was also, first and always, a king, and kings, in this whole family, get to hand out justice. Zeus handed out quite a lot of it, and some of his most memorable judgments weren't about love affairs at all. They were about mortals who broke the most sacred rules of hospitality and trust, and paid for it in punishments so specific and so eternal that we're still using their names as verbs and adjectives thousands of years later. Take Ixion. He was a mortal king, guilty of murdering his own father-in-law, a crime so shocking that no one in the mortal world would even agree to purify him of it, the ritual cleansing that was supposed to be available to any sinner, however grave the offense. Zeus, in an act of genuine mercy that honestly feels a little out of character, given everything you've heard so far tonight, took pity on him, purified him himself, invited him up to Olympus to dine among the gods. Ixion repaid that mercy by trying to seduce Hera. I want you to sit with the sheer audacity of that for a second. A man forgiven for murder, welcomed into the literal home of the gods, and his first real instinct once he got there was to make a move on the queen herself. Zeus, understandably furious, tested him, crafted a cloud in the exact shape of Hera, letting Ixion believe he'd succeeded, and once the deception was confirmed, threw him out of Olympus and down to Tartarus for a punishment as creative as the crime deserved. He was bound to a wheel of fire, spinning eternally through the sky, never able to stop, never able to rest. If you've ever heard someone described as being on a wheel, spinning through the same mistake over and over with no way off, that's Ixion's wheel they're describing, whether they know it or not. Then there's Tantalus, whose name gave us the word tantalize, and once you hear his punishment, you'll understand exactly why. He was a mortal king, a son of Zeus himself by some accounts, who'd been welcomed to dine at the god's own table, quite an honor, and quite thoroughly wasted. He decided to test whether the gods were truly all-knowing by killing his own son, cooking the boy, and serving him up as a meal, essentially running the exact same horrifying experiment Lycaon had tried on Zeus earlier tonight. The gods, unlike Lycaon's dinner guests, were not fooled for even a moment. Every single one of them recognized what was on the plate and refused to touch it, except for Demeter, distracted by grief over her missing daughter Persephone, who absent-mindedly ate a piece of the boy's shoulder before anyone stopped her. The gods restored the son to life afterward, replacing the missing shoulder with one carved from ivory, and turned their full fury on Tantalus himself. His punishment, standing forever in a pool of water beneath a tree heavy with fruit, both perpetually just out of reach. Every time he bent to drink, the water receded before it touched his lips. Every time he reached for the fruit, the branches lifted just beyond his fingertips. Eternal thirst, eternal hunger, everything he wanted visible. Close and permanently unreachable. And finally Sisyphus, perhaps the cleverest, most stubborn mortal in the entire mythology, a king who managed to cheat death itself not once but twice, tricking Hades on one occasion and outright chaining up the god of death on another. delaying the natural order of the universe simply because he refused, on principle, to die when it was his turn. Zeus, once all of Sisyphus's tricks had finally run their course and death caught up with him for good, handed down a punishment that has become, honestly, the single most famous eternal torment in the entire mythology. Sisyphus was condemned to push an enormous boulder up a steep hill in the underworld, and every single time he neared the top, exhausted, the boulder would slip from his grasp and roll all the way back down to the bottom, forcing him to start again. Forever, no completion. No rest, just the same effort, endlessly repeated, with the finish line permanently, mockingly, just out of reach. Next time somebody describes a task as Sisyphean, pointless, endless, doomed to reset the moment you're nearly finished, you'll know exactly which king earned that description and exactly which other king made sure it would last forever. One more name belongs in this particular gallery, and he might be my favorite of the bunch, because his crime wasn't murder or cannibalism or an attempted seduction of the queen. His crime was simply bad taste dressed up as blasphemy. Salmoneus was a mortal king who developed, somewhere along the way, a genuinely bizarre obsession. He wanted to be worshipped as Zeus, not metaphorically, not as some honored favorite of the god. He wanted the actual title, the actual reverence, the actual sacrifices that belonged to the king of the gods himself, and rather than wait around hoping mortals might eventually decide he deserved it, he simply started staging the part. He rigged up bronze cauldrons and dragged them behind his chariot through the streets of his own city, the clatter and clang meant to mimic the sound of thunder rolling across the sky. He hurled flaming torches into the air to imitate lightning bolts, lighting up the night the way Zeus's own bolts did when he was truly angry. He declared himself worthy of divine sacrifice, and by some accounts, actually managed to convince a portion of his own subjects to go along with the charade, offering him worship that belonged, by every law of this universe, to somebody else entirely. Zeus did not find the impression flattering. He answered Salmoneus's fake thunder with the genuine article, a real thunderbolt aimed with considerably more precision than a man banging cauldrons together could ever hope to imitate, striking the pretend king dead on the spot, and in most tellings, leveling a fair portion of his city along with him, just to make the point unmistakable to anyone who might be tempted to try the same stunt afterward. Almost a comedy sketch, if you squint at it right, a mortal king clanging pots together and lobbing torches into the sky, playing dress-up as the ruler of the universe, right up until the universe's actual ruler decided he'd heard quite enough amateur thunder for one lifetime. But underneath, the comedy sits the same lesson every single story in this particular gallery keeps teaching over and over in ever more creative ways. This king tolerated a great deal from the people beneath him. Wandering husbands got forgiven, clever tricksters got promoted, but pretend to be him, even for one night, even with nothing but cauldrons and torches, and the real thing arrives to correct the record personally every single time. Here's the pattern worth noticing across all three of these. Zeus's justice, when it landed on men who'd actually earned it, murderers, cannibals, tricksters who mocked the gods to their faces, was creative, permanent, and genuinely, mythologically unforgettable. It's almost as if the punishments he was capable of dreaming up for guilty men were entirely different in kind from the punishments Hera handed down to innocent women. Different crimes, very, very different consequences. Make of that what you will. The Greeks certainly did for about 3,000 years running. One more tragedy belongs in this same company, though it isn't Zeus's hand that delivers the punishment directly this time. It's his children's, and it happens because a mortal queen made the fatal mistake of comparing herself to a goddess who'd already suffered more than enough for one lifetime. Her name was Niobe, Queen of Thebes, and she had by any mortal measure an enviable life, 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, wealth, a kingdom, a husband who adored her. And at a festival held in Leto's honor, the very goddess who'd once wandered the earth for months turned away from every shore before finally giving birth on a floating island. Niobe made a boast that has echoed down through 3,000 years of storytelling as one of the single worst things anyone in everything you've heard tonight ever said out loud. Why honor Leto, she asked the gathered crowd, when Leto had only 2 children and she herself had 14. Surely, Niobe reasoned, that made her the more accomplished mother, more deserving of worship and praise than a goddess with only half a dozen, well, 2 children to her name. It's the kind of pride that this whole tangled family never, ever let slide, and Niobe, apparently, had never actually met Leto's 2 children before making that comparison out loud. Because Leto's 2 children were Apollo and Artemis, and neither of them took kindly to hearing their mother mocked for the size of her family, especially not after everything she'd endured just to bring them safely into the world. Apollo and Artemis descended together, and in a single devastating volley, shot down every one of Niobe's 14 children, Apollo taking the 7 sons, Artemis the 7 daughters, arrows finding each of them in turn, while their mother watched, helpless, unable to stop a single one. Niobe's grief, once every child lay dead, was so total, so complete, that the story tells us she simply turned to stone where she stood, transformed by the sheer unbearable weight of what she'd lost. Some tellings place her, still weeping, on a mountainside in Anatolia, a rock formation that, if you look at it from the right angle even today, seems to show the shape of a grieving woman, tears running eternally down stone that was once a mother's face. Zeus doesn't speak a single line in this particular story. He doesn't need to. His children carried out the punishment themselves, swiftly and completely, and their father's silence on the matter is its own kind of statement. This is a family that does not tolerate insults to its own honor, and it will answer those insults with a thoroughness that leaves absolutely no room for appeal. It's a hard story to sit with, and I won't pretend otherwise. 14 children, dead for their mother's pride, a punishment so disproportionate to the crime that even 3,000 years later, it still catches in the throat a little to tell it properly. But that's this family, laid bare one more time. Mock them, even once, even out of grief-blind pride at your own good fortune, and the reckoning that follows will not be measured in anything close to fair proportion. Not every story about Zeus and mortals ends in punishment, and I think it's worth telling you one that ends the other way, if only so you don't walk away from tonight believing this king was nothing but thunderbolts and grudges. Zeus and Hermes, the story goes, once traveled through the countryside of Phrygia disguised as ordinary weary travelers, going door to door, asking for nothing more than a meal and a place to rest for the night. And door after door, they were turned away, hundreds of houses, hundreds of refusals, from people who took one look at 2 dusty, tired strangers and decided they had nothing to spare. Except one house, the smallest, poorest cottage in the entire region, home to an old couple named Baucis and Philemon, who'd been married their whole lives and had almost nothing to their name beyond each other and a small, humble farm. They welcomed the 2 strangers in without a moment's hesitation, offered them the best of what little food they had, and even considered killing their only goose, their last real possession of any value, to make sure their guests ate well. The gods, moved by a generosity that hundreds of wealthier households couldn't be bothered to offer, revealed their true identities and rewarded the old couple in the gentlest way this whole reign ever manages. They granted Baucis and Philemon's one wish, which wasn't for riches or power or eternal youth, but simply this, that neither of them would ever have to live a single day without the other. When the time came for them to die, they died together, in the same instant, and were transformed into 2 trees, growing from a single trunk, their branches intertwined forever. Meanwhile, the rest of that region, every household that had turned the 2 travelers away, was destroyed in a flood, sparing only the small cottage where kindness had actually been offered, which Zeus transformed into a golden temple in gratitude. It's a small story, tucked into the corner of a much larger mythology, and it doesn't get told nearly as often as the thunderbolts and the affairs. But I think it's one of the truest things everything you've heard tonight ever says about its king. He could be monstrous, and he could be petty, and he could hand out suffering with a casualness that still makes people wince 3,000 years later. But every now and then, when somebody showed him real, unguarded kindness with nothing to gain from it, he remembered, and he paid it back in kind. Keep that in your pocket. We are about to head into the biggest war this whole family's history ever produced, and you'll want to remember that this king was capable of gentleness, because you won't see very much of it for a while. Let's pause the plot again for a second, because we're deep enough into his reign now that it's worth asking the question plainly. What kind of king was this, really, once you strip away the thunderbolts and the transformations and just look at the pattern underneath? He was generous with monsters and stingy with mercy. Free every prisoner useful to him and bury every prisoner who wasn't. That's rule number one, and it never really changes across this whole family, from the Cyclopes in Tartarus to Prometheus on his rock. He punished defiance in mortals like it was a personal insult, and rewarded defiance in his own children like it was a personality trait worth admiring. Ask Lycaon, turned into a wolf for one bad dinner. Then ask Hermes, who stole cattle before he could walk and got a promotion out of it. He built humanity, lost patience with it, and started over more than once. That's not fatherhood. That's a man who never quite learned the difference between raising something and running it. He loved fiercely and briefly, the way weather loves a coastline. Total devastation, followed by clear skies, followed by absolutely no memory of the storm by the time the next one rolls in. He kept every promise that cost him nothing and broke every promise that cost him comfort. Ask Semele, who died holding an oath he was legally bound to keep and personally desperate to escape. He handed down justice with real creativity when the guilty were men, and remarkably little curiosity about guilt at all when the punished were women who'd never been given a choice in the first place. He was, by every account, magnificent to witness and miserable to depend on, a king you'd want ruling the sky above you, and the last king on earth you'd want managing your family. And here's the part that's easy to miss, buried under all the thunder. For every cruelty in his reign, there's a mercy sitting right beside it, close enough to touch. He chained Prometheus to a rock for centuries and let Heracles free him in the end, once the debt had run its course. He hung his own wife from the sky in chains and released her eventually once the point had been made. He drowned nearly all of humanity in a flood and warned the one family worth saving in time to build an ark. He never fully redeemed himself in any of these stories, but he never fully condemned himself either. He just kept being exactly what he was, over and over, for 3,000 years, and let history sort out whether that added up to a hero or a warning. Maybe that's the most honest thing anyone can say about absolute power, wrapped in a god's name and handed down through enough centuries of storytelling to wear smooth. It doesn't make you good, and it doesn't make you evil. It just makes you very, very hard to say no to. Every one-liner about Zeus you'll ever hear boils down to some version of that same joke. He's the king of the gods, and also the reason half the pantheon needs family therapy. He invented justice and violated it constantly, sometimes in the very same afternoon. He's proof that you can win every war you ever fight and still lose most of the arguments that actually mattered. That's the king everything you've heard tonight is about. Let's get back to him. You've already heard how the seeds of the Trojan War were planted. A swan, a lake, a queen named Leda, and a daughter named Helen born from that union, who would grow up to become the most fought-over woman in the ancient world. What you haven't heard yet is Zeus's own role once that war actually broke out, because for 10 long years, the king of the gods found himself in a position he genuinely hated, forced to referee a conflict between his own family members, who had picked sides against each other with the same stubbornness they'd once shown fighting titans. Athenian Hera backed the Greeks, still nursing an old grudge against Troy from an entirely different story: a golden apple, a beauty contest, a Trojan prince named Paris who judged that contest and picked Aphrodite over both of them, a decision neither goddess ever quite forgave. Aphrodite, naturally, backed Troy in return, since Paris had chosen her. Apollo and Artemis leaned Trojan as well. The family that had once united to overthrow a common enemy now spent a decade sniping at each other from opposite sides of a mortal war. And Zeus, technically in charge of all of them, mostly just tried to keep the whole thing from spiraling completely out of his control. He wasn't entirely successful. Gods snuck onto the battlefield constantly, healing their favorites, misdirecting spears, occasionally getting wounded themselves in the crossfire, which, if you think about it, is a genuinely strange sentence to have to say about beings who are supposed to be immortal and untouchable. Zeus eventually had to forbid the other gods from interfering directly at all, a rule that lasted about as long as most of his rules tended to last once his own family decided they didn't feel like following it. There's one more scene from that war worth telling before we get to Sarpedon, because it might be the single most embarrassing moment of Zeus's entire reign, and I mean that as a compliment to whoever first thought it up. Even kings get outmaneuvered. This is the story of the one time it happened to him in his own bedroom. The war had been dragging on for years, favoring the Trojans for a long, grinding stretch after Zeus, still smarting over his own son Sarpedon's coming death, and increasingly weary of the whole conflict, forbade the other gods from interfering and threw his own weight behind Troy's side for a while, just to balance out years of Greek success. Hera, backing the Greeks as fiercely as ever, watched her side suffer defeat after defeat and decided, finally, that if she couldn't out-argue her husband, she'd simply have to out-seduce him instead. She went to Aphrodite, an odd ally, given how little love was lost between the two of them most days, and asked, without fully explaining why, to borrow her magic girdle, an accessory so laced with charm and desire that no one, god or mortal, could resist the wearer once it was on. Aphrodite, either not suspecting the scheme or simply not caring enough to ask questions, handed it over. Hera, bathed, dressed in her finest, borrowed Aphrodite's girdle, and for good measure arranged for Hypnos, the god of sleep, to be waiting nearby, bribed with the promise of marriage to one of the three graces if he'd agree to put Zeus soundly to sleep the moment his guard was fully down. Then she went to find her husband. Zeus, catching sight of her dressed like that, practically forgot the war entirely. The old accounts doesn't hold back on this part. He was more thoroughly enchanted by his own wife in that single moment than he'd been by any of the mortal women or nymphs across everything that's happened so far, ironic as that is, given everything you've already heard about where his attention usually wandered. He swept her off to a private spot, wrapped in a golden cloud so dense that not even the sun could see through it, and the two of them fell into bed together with the kind of urgency that had, apparently, been missing from their marriage for quite some time. The moment he fell asleep afterward, precisely as bribed, Hypnos slipped away to warn Poseidon that the coast, so to speak, was clear. And Poseidon, who'd been itching to help the Greeks directly for ages, held back only by his brother's explicit orders, surged onto the battlefield the moment Zeus's attention was fully thoroughly elsewhere, rallying the Greek forces and turning the tide of the entire war back in their favor, while the king of the gods lay unconscious in a golden cloud, thoroughly seduced by his own wife's borrowed charms. When Zeus finally woke and looked down to find the battle completely reversed from where he'd left it, his fury was, shall we say, considerable. He knew immediately what had happened, not the details perhaps, but the shape of it, the unmistakable feeling of having been played. Hera, to her credit, didn't even bother denying it once confronted. She'd gotten exactly what she wanted, watched her own husband outmaneuvered by nothing more than a borrowed girdle and some well-timed sleep, and the war swung back toward the Greeks because of it. It's one of the only stories in this whole tangled family where Hera comes out looking genuinely, unambiguously clever rather than simply vengeful, using the very weapon Zeus always used against everyone else, desire itself, and turning it back on him with a precision he never saw coming. For one afternoon, at least, the trickster got tricked. The king who'd spent centuries transforming into swans and bulls and showers of gold to get what he wanted found out exactly how it feels from the other side of the deception. He didn't take it well, and the fallout wasn't pretty threats, fury, promises of punishment that mostly amounted to a great deal of shouting once the two of them were alone again. But the war had already turned, and no amount of divine anger afterward could undo an afternoon that had already happened. Some victories, even for a king who ruled the sky, simply can't be walked back once the golden cloud lifts. There's one more scene from that long war worth setting down before we move past it entirely, because for one single, chaotic afternoon, Zeus did something he'd spent the whole rest of the conflict trying to avoid. He let the gods fight each other directly, in full view of the mortal armies below, and the result was as strange and as violent as you'd expect from a family that had already spent ages settling its disagreements with mountains and thunderbolts. By this stage in the war, Achilles had rejoined the fighting, driven half-mad with grief over the death of his closest companion, Patroclus, and cutting through Trojan ranks with a fury that threatened to end the entire war in a single, overwhelming afternoon, which was, as it happened, not actually part of the fate the fates had spun for this particular conflict. Troy wasn't due to fall yet. Not like this, not in one man's rampage. So Zeus, worried the whole careful balance of the war was about to collapse under the weight of one grieving hero's fury, lifted his ban on direct divine interference and told the gods, in essence, "Go ahead, get involved, sort this out yourselves." They did not sort it out gently. Athene squared off against Ares, and where the war god relied on brute force and fury, Athene relied on the same cool strategic mind that had made her Zeus's most trusted advisor, and she put Ares down hard, striking him with a boulder that sent the god of war sprawling across 7 acres of battlefield, an image that must have been genuinely satisfying to every soldier who'd ever watched Ares delight in violence without ever paying much of a price for it himself. Poseidon and Apollo faced off, sea against sun, though that particular confrontation ended less in blows than in a kind of mutual, exasperated standoff. Poseidon needling his younger nephew about a past humiliation, Apollo declining to fight an uncle over mortals he considered beneath either of their attention, and the two of them essentially agreeing not to bother finishing the argument. Hera came to blows with Artemis directly, boxing the younger goddess's ears with her own bow until Artemis fled the field in tears, running to her father Zeus for comfort the way any child might after a beating from an aunt considerably more experienced in a fight. And the river god Scamander, furious at Achilles for choking his own waters with the bodies of the men he'd slaughtered, rose up and very nearly drowned the hero outright, a river doing what no Trojan soldier had yet managed, until Hephaestus, at the other god's urging, unleashed his own fire across the riverbanks and boiled the god's waters back into submission. Through all of it, Zeus mostly watched from his own seat above the fray, thundering with what the old accounts describes as genuine delight, laughing at the spectacle of his own family tearing into each other across a mortal battlefield, entertained by a fight he'd authorized specifically to keep one grieving mortal from accidentally unraveling the whole plotted shape of a war that still had a fixed and fated ending to reach. It's one of the strangest scenes in the entire mythology if you step back and really look at it. A king watching his own children brawl across a battlefield built from human corpses, laughing the whole time, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of something closer to relief, the release valve of a ruler who'd spent years holding an impossibly tense family together, finally letting them blow off steam in a fight that, whatever damage it did to each other's pride, could never permanently harm a single one of them. Mortals died by the thousands in that war. Gods just got embarrassed for an afternoon and went home for dinner anyway. That's the fundamental unfairness sitting underneath this whole reign, and this scene captures it about as plainly as any single moment could. The stakes were never really the same for both sides of that battlefield. Immortals bled, briefly, and recovered. Mortals simply died and stayed that way. But the moment that shows you the real weight Zeus carried during that war, the one that stuck with storytellers longer than almost any other scene from the whole conflict, involves his own son. Sarpedon was a Lycian prince, fighting on the Trojan side, and also, as it happened, one of Zeus's own mortal children, a son the king loved deeply, the way he seemed to love nearly all his children once they were actually born, whatever chaos had preceded their conception. And in the thick of the fighting, Zeus watched Sarpedon's fate approach, a duel with the Greek hero Patroclus, one that Sarpedon, by the threads the fates had already spun, was destined to lose. Zeus considered breaking that fate, considered simply reaching down and plucking his son off the battlefield, sparing him the death that was coming, using the full and total power of a king who could, in theory, do exactly that if he chose to. Hera talked him out of it. She reminded him, and it's one of the sharpest, most honest moments in this whole family's history, that if Zeus saved his own son from a fate every other god was required to respect, every other god with a mortal child in danger would expect the exact same mercy. The whole fragile order of fate and mortality, the very thing that made the gods' power meaningful in the first place, would collapse the moment the king started making exceptions for the people he loved most. Zeus listened, and he let his son die. He didn't do it without ceremony, though the story tells us he wept tears of blood, actual drops of red rain falling onto the battlefield as Sarpedon fell to Patroclus's spear below. A king, watching his own child die, unable to intervene, not because he lacked the power, but because the entire structure of the universe he ruled depended on him choosing not to use it. That's the loneliest kind of power there is, if you ask me, strong enough to save anyone, bound by rules too important to break, even for the people you love most. He did grant one small mercy, once Sarpedon had fallen. He had Apollo carry the body from the battlefield, cleaned and anointed, and sent the twin gods Sleep and Death to carry him gently home to Lycia for a proper burial among his own people, rather than leaving him to rot on foreign soil fought over by armies who barely knew his name. It's a small comfort, set against an enormous loss, but it's the comfort a king could actually give once he'd already decided the larger mercy wasn't his to grant. The war ground on for years after that, through countless deaths on both sides, through the fall of Achilles and the eventual fall of Troy itself, which you already know the shape of if you've heard the story of Odysseus's long road home from that very war. Zeus watched all of it, weighed fates on a golden scale when the moment called for it, literally holding the destinies of great warriors up against each other in the balance, watching which side of the scale sank lower to determine who would live and who would die that day, and mostly, through the whole grinding decade of it, simply endured. Kingship, it turns out, even divine kingship, is very often just that. Enduring things you have the power to stop, because stopping them would cost you something even greater. Before we get to the war that ends this family's golden age, there are a few more corners of Zeus's story worth lingering in, because for every tale of thunderbolts and jealous queens, there's a quieter one about what this king actually built during the long, comparatively peaceful centuries between wars. Let's start with the Muses, because without them, half the stories in this whole family would never have been written down in the first place. Zeus, in one of his less complicated romantic entanglements, spent 9 consecutive nights with a titaness named Mnemosyne, whose name means, appropriately enough, memory itself. From those 9 nights came 9 daughters, the Muses, each one presiding over a different art: Calliope for epic poetry, Clio for history, Euterpe for music, Melpomene for tragedy, Thalia for comedy, Terpsichore for dance, Erato for love poetry, Polyhymnia for sacred song, Urania for astronomy. 9 daughters, born from a god and the personification of memory itself, and every single poet, every playwright, every historian in the ancient world who ever sat down to begin a work invoked one of them first, asking for inspiration before daring to put a single word on the page. Think about the audacity of that lineage, if you want the one-liner. The king of the gods fathered an entire department of the arts in 9 nights flat, and everybody who ever wanted to write anything worth remembering had to ask his daughters for permission first. It's a nice origin story, as these things go considerably gentler than most of what you've heard tonight. No jealous queen hunting anyone down afterward, no mortal turned into an animal or a constellation out of spite. Mnemosyne raised her daughters on Olympus, and the Muses became, in their own quiet way, some of the most beloved and least controversial of all Zeus's many children. Every storyteller who's ever opened a tale with "Sing to me, O Muse," is, whether they know it or not, calling on one of Zeus's daughters to help carry the weight of the telling. There's one more marriage worth mentioning before we move past this part of Zeus's story, because it's less about passion and more about architecture, the actual scaffolding that holds the rest of the universe together, built quietly, without a single monster or jealous outburst involved. Themis was a titaness, goddess of divine law and order, one of the few titans who never fought against Zeus in the first place, and their union produced children who don't get nearly the attention of Zeus's more dramatic offspring, but who arguably do more work holding this whole cosmos together than almost anyone else on the family tree. First came the Hori, the seasons, not the natural cycle of planting and harvest that Demeter and Persephone's own story explains, but something closer to the seasons of civilization itself. Eunomia, meaning good order, Dike, meaning justice, and Irene, meaning peace. 3 daughters, each one a governing principle rather than a personality, standing guard at the gates of Olympus itself, and regulating the movement of the stars, the turning of the year, and in the most literal sense the Greeks could imagine, the difference between a well-run world and a chaotic one. Then came the Moirai, the Fates, 3 sisters, Clotho, who spins the thread of every mortal life, Lachesis, who measures out how long that thread will run, and Atropos, who cuts it at the appointed hour with shears no god or mortal has ever managed to argue their way past. Here's the detail worth sitting with, because it tells you something genuinely important about the limits of even Zeus's own power. The Fates outrank him, not officially, not in any formal sense that gets written into the family hierarchy, but functionally, absolutely. You saw it already, back at Troy, when Zeus wept tears of blood watching his own son Sarpedon die rather than break the thread the Fates had already measured out. Even the king of the gods, with a thunderbolt in his hand and an entire pantheon at his command, does not get to argue with his own daughters once they've decided how long a life will run. It's a strange, almost humbling thing to learn this late into a story that's mostly been about how little stood in this king's way. Titans fell to him, monsters fell to him, giants, rivals, unfaithful mortals, disobedient sons, all of it, eventually, bent to his will one way or another. But three quiet daughters with a spindle, a measuring rod, and a pair of shears. Not even Zeus argues with them twice. That's the real shape of divine order. If this whole family's story has a philosophy buried underneath all the thunder, power can rearrange almost anything in this universe. It can move mountains, drown continents, and reshape entire ages of mankind. But it cannot touch the thread once it's cut. Some things, even for a king this powerful, simply aren't his to control. Demeter's story with Zeus is trickier, and it tangles with grief in a way that shaped the whole rhythm of the natural world, so let's take it slow. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, one of the 5 siblings Zeus had rescued from their father's stomach all those centuries earlier, bore Zeus a daughter. Persephone, radiant and beloved, doted on by her mother in a way that bordered on the fiercely protective. Demeter kept her close, sheltered her from most of Olympus's chaos, and might well have kept her that way forever, if not for a decision Zeus made without bothering to consult the one parent who actually cared. Hades, down in his own quiet kingdom, had fallen for Persephone from a distance, and asked his brother for permission to take her as his bride. Zeus, who, as you've gathered by now, rarely let the feelings of mothers slow him down when a decision needed making, agreed on his brother's behalf, without ever telling Demeter a word of it. So Hades came up from the underworld one afternoon while Persephone was picking flowers in a meadow, and the earth split open beneath her, and he pulled her down into his own realm to be his queen, whether she'd agreed to it or not. Demeter searched for her daughter across the entire world and found nothing, and her grief, being the grief of the goddess who controlled every harvest on earth, didn't stay contained to her own heart for long. Crops withered, fields turned barren. Famine spread across the whole of humanity because a goddess mourning her missing child had simply stopped doing her job, and no one, not even Zeus, who had, after all, quietly authorized the whole disaster, could talk her into caring about anything else until her daughter was found. Eventually, faced with the genuine possibility that humanity might starve to extinction over a decision he'd made without asking anyone, Zeus finally intervened and sent Hermes down to negotiate Persephone's return. There was a catch, and it's the kind of catch that only makes sense in a mythology this particular about rules. Persephone had eaten a handful of pomegranate seeds while in the underworld. Some tellings say she was tricked into it, others that she ate them freely, not yet knowing the consequence. And anyone who eats the food of the dead is bound, at least in part, to remain there. A compromise was struck. Persephone would spend part of each year below as Hades' queen and part of each year above, restored to her mother. And that, the old story tells us, is the origin of the seasons themselves. Every year when Persephone descends to the underworld, Demeter's grief returns with her, and the earth goes cold and barren, autumn, winter, the fields lying fallow. Every year when her daughter returns to the surface, Demeter's joy floods back into the world, and everything blooms again, spring, summer, the harvest restored. It's one of the few myths in everything you've heard tonight where Zeus's carelessness doesn't get cleaned up neatly by the end. He fixed the immediate crisis. Yes, humanity didn't starve, the fields grew again, but he never fully undid the bargain he'd struck behind Demeter's back in the first place. Every winter since is, in a sense, still an argument between two parents that never quite got fully resolved. Then there's Maia, quietest and shyest of the 7 Pleiades, who bore Zeus a son in a secluded mountain cave, a birth that led, within the very same day, to one of the funniest and most audacious stories in the whole mythology. The son was Hermes, and he was, from his very first hours of life, exactly the trickster god he'd grow up to be for the rest of eternity. Barely out of his cradle, he slipped away from his sleeping mother, wandered outside, and immediately stole a herd of cattle belonging to his own half-brother, Apollo. Not just stole them, either, covered his tracks like a professional. He drove the cattle backward, so their hoofprints would suggest they'd walked in the opposite direction of where he'd actually taken them, fashioned sandals out of bark to disguise his own footprints, and hid the herd away before returning to his cradle and wrapping himself back up in swaddling clothes like the perfectly innocent newborn he most certainly was not. Apollo, discovering the theft, tracked the trail back to Maya's cave anyway. You don't get to be the god of prophecy without a certain talent for figuring things out, and confronted the infant directly, accusing him outright of cattle theft. Hermes, lying in his crib, looked up at his furious older brother, and with a straight face that must have been a marvel to witness, insisted he was just a baby, far too young and helpless to steal anything at all. They brought the dispute before Zeus himself, up on Olympus, and Zeus, presiding over what might be the single most absurd trial in the entire mythology, a newborn accused of grand larceny, took one look at his own son's performance and by most accounts could barely keep from laughing outright. He ordered Hermes to return the cattle, which the infant did without much fuss, but the sheer audacity of the theft and the poise of the lie that followed it seems to have won Zeus over almost entirely. Hermes made peace with Apollo by offering him a gift, a lyre which the clever infant had invented that same day out of a tortoise shell and cow gut, an instrument so beautiful that Apollo forgave the theft on the spot in exchange for it. And Zeus, delighted by a son who could talk his way out of a crime he'd committed before he was even a day old, made Hermes his own personal messenger, the god who moves fastest between every corner of the universe, patron of travelers, thieves, and tricksters alike, because who better to send running errands across creation than the one god clever enough to steal a herd of cattle before he could even walk. If you want the whole shape of Zeus's parenting philosophy in one line that tells you the whole thing cleanly, punish the mortals who lie to your face, but forgive, even reward, your own children when the lie is clever enough to make you laugh. Let's talk about the judgment of Paris properly, since I only mentioned it in passing earlier, because it's really the hinge the entire Trojan War swings on, and Zeus, characteristically, arranged the whole disaster and then made absolutely certain he wasn't the one who had to hand down the verdict. It started at a wedding, the marriage of the sea nymph Thetis to a mortal king named Peleus, a union arranged in part because a prophecy warned that Thetis's son would grow up to surpass his own father in power, and Zeus, who had rather a lot of personal experience with exactly that kind of prophecy, made very sure Thetis married a mortal instead of a god, just to keep the resulting child safely beneath everyone on Olympus. Every god was invited to that wedding except one, Eris, goddess of discord, deliberately left off the guest list because nobody, understandably, wanted to deal with the chaos she tended to bring wherever she went. Eris, furious at the snub, showed up anyway and tossed a golden apple into the middle of the feast, inscribed with a single phrase, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, queen of Olympus; Athene, goddess of wisdom and war; Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. And a fight broke out, not a physical one, not yet, but a battle of pride fierce enough that the whole wedding threatened to collapse into chaos before the guests had even finished their first course. They brought the dispute to Zeus, naturally, expecting the king of the gods to settle it. And Zeus, who had personally been married to one of the 3 contestants for longer than most civilizations had existed, and who understood exactly how catastrophic it would be to publicly rank his own wife below either of the other two, did something almost admirably cowardly. He refused to judge it himself. Instead, he handed the whole mess off to a mortal, a Trojan prince named Paris, tending sheep on a hillside, with absolutely no idea his afternoon was about to determine the fate of an entire civilization. Each goddess, once the apple was in Paris's hands, tried to bribe him outright. Hera offered him power, kingship over all of Asia. Athene offered wisdom and victory in every battle he'd ever fight. Aphrodite offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the entire world. Paris chose Aphrodite, and the most beautiful woman in the world, as it happened, was already married to a Greek king named Menelaus. Her name, of course, was Helen, daughter of Leda and that swan from the lake, all those years earlier. Aphrodite made good on her promise, and Helen left with Paris for Troy, and Menelaus, humiliated and furious, called on every king in Greece to help him take her back, an oath they'd all sworn years earlier when they were competing suitors for Helen's hand, that whoever she chose, the rest would defend that marriage against any threat. 1,000 ships, 10 years of war, an entire city burned to the ground, all of it traced back to one god who didn't want to be blamed for insulting his own wife and handed the decision to a shepherd instead. That's Zeus's fingerprints on the whole disaster, even though he never lifted a finger to start it directly. He didn't throw the apple, he didn't choose Aphrodite, but he's the one who set the trap in the first place, arranging Thetis's marriage to keep a prophecy from ever threatening his own throne, and he's the one who ducked the one decision that might have stopped the whole chain of events before it ever really got moving. Sometimes the most consequential thing a king does is refuse to make a call and let somebody smaller carry the weight of it instead. There's one more thread worth pulling before we head into the war itself, and it circles all the way back to a promise Zeus made a very long time ago, chained to a rock with an eagle for company. Prometheus, you'll remember, was still up on that mountain in the Caucasus, still losing his liver to Zeus's eagle every single day, an eternity of punishment for the crime of giving humanity fire. And an eternity, even by divine standards, is a genuinely long time to hold a grudge. But eternity, in this particular story, eventually found its edge. Generations passed. Empires of mortals rose on the strength of the very fire Prometheus had stolen for them, forging bronze and iron, building cities, doing everything a species does once it's finally been given the tools to stop merely surviving and start building. And somewhere in the middle of all that human progress, a hero came wandering through the Caucasus on the 11th of his famous 12 labors. Heracles, son of Zeus and Alcmene, the very child Hera had spent his entire life trying to destroy. Heracles found Prometheus still chained there, still visited daily by that eagle, and did something no god in all the centuries since the punishment began had ever bothered to do. He shot the eagle out of the sky, freed Prometheus from his chains with his own hands, and ended a torment that had run, by most reckonings, for longer than most human civilizations have ever lasted. Zeus, remarkably, allowed it. Some accounts say he'd simply grown to respect the endurance Prometheus had shown across all those centuries, that the punishment had made its point so thoroughly it no longer needed to continue. Others suggest a more practical motive. Prometheus, gifted with foresight as his very name implies, knew a secret Zeus desperately needed, a warning about which of his own future lovers carried a child destined to overthrow him, the same kind of prophecy that had already cost Zeus one wife, swallowed whole to avoid exactly this fate. Prometheus, freed at last, finally told him. It was Thetis, the very sea nymph married off to a mortal at that fateful wedding, where the golden apple first appeared, proof that even a decision made to dodge one disaster can end up quietly preventing another. Whatever the reason, Prometheus walked free after an eternity of suffering, his liver finally left to heal in peace, and it stands as one of the very few moments in everything you've heard tonight where Zeus's mercy actually caught up with the length of his cruelty. It only took a few thousand years, and a hero he'd fathered specifically, in part, to help win a war against giants. But it caught up eventually. That's not nothing, even if it took a very long time getting there. You've met two of the seven Pleiades already tonight without quite realizing it was a set. Maia, mother of clever Hermes, and Electra, mother of Dardanus, whose bloodline eventually built the walls of Troy. It's worth taking a moment now to explain where that whole family of sisters actually came from, and how they ended up scattered across the night sky together, because it's one of the gentler star stories in this whole tangled family, and after Niobe and the Golden Anvils, I think we've earned a gentler one. The Pleiades were seven sisters, daughters of the Titan Atlas, yes, that Atlas, still holding up the sky at the edge of the world even as his own daughters wandered freely across it, and Zeus, characteristically, took a considerable interest in several of them. Maia and Electra you already know. A third sister, Taygete, caught his eye as well, and unlike some of the women you've already heard about, she wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. Taygete ran, fled from Zeus's pursuit with the same desperate persistence Callisto and so many others had shown before her, and appealed to Artemis for protection, the same goddess who'd once welcomed Callisto into her own company of sworn virgin huntresses. Artemis, moved by the plea, transformed Taygete into a doe, hiding her in that shape long enough to slip free of Zeus's pursuit entirely. One of the rare stories in everything you've heard tonight where the transformation actually works as an escape, rather than becoming a punishment handed down afterward by a jealous queen. Taygete was eventually restored to her own shape, grateful enough to Artemis that she dedicated a golden-horned hind to her in thanks, the very same magical deer, some tellings say, that Heracles would later chase down as one of his own 12 labors, generations afterward. Even a story about narrowly escaping Zeus's attention manages to loop back, eventually, into the wider tapestry of this whole reign. The seven sisters, along with their parents, were eventually placed together in the night sky as a cluster of stars, still visible today, still called by their original name in nearly every language that bothers to name it at all. Sailors used to navigate by them. Farmers used to time their planting by when the cluster rose and set. An entire practical calendar built into the sky out of seven sisters, most of them once pursued relentlessly by the very king whose family filled up half the rest of the heavens around them. It's a small, quiet detail to end this particular thread on, and I like it for exactly that reason. Not every story about this family needs a monster or a curse or a war. Sometimes it's just seven sisters and the stars they became, and the small mercy of one of them managing to get away. There's a whole category of Zeus's children worth pausing on before we move any further, because not every son he fathered grew up to be beloved. Some grew up to be warnings. Take Tityos, born to a nymph named Ilara, whom Zeus hid from Hera's notice by concealing her deep beneath the earth to give birth in secret, a level of paranoid precaution that tells you Hera's reputation had, by this point in the story, thoroughly earned itself. Tityos grew to enormous size, a giant in every sense of the word, and might have lived out a fairly unremarkable mythological life if he hadn't made the catastrophic decision, years later, to attempt an assault on Leto, the very goddess who'd once wandered the earth in search of somewhere to give birth to Apollo and Artemis, back when no land dared shelter her for fear of Hera's wrath. Apollo and Artemis, hearing of the attack on their own mother, didn't wait for their father to intervene. They killed Tityos themselves, on the spot, twin arrows finding their mark before he ever got close to finishing what he'd started. And Zeus, rather than mourning a son cut down so swiftly, backed his other children's judgment completely, sentencing Tityos to an eternity in Tartarus that mirrors Prometheus's own punishment almost exactly. Stretched out across 9 acres of ground, immobile, while vultures descended daily to feed on his liver, which regrew each night only to be eaten again the next morning. It's worth noticing the difference between these two punishments, side by side. Prometheus suffered for an act of generosity toward a species that had nothing to give him in return. Tityos suffered for an act of violence against a goddess who'd already survived one prolonged campaign of cruelty and didn't deserve another. Same eternal torment, dispensed by the same king, for crimes about as far apart on the moral spectrum as two crimes can possibly be. Zeus's justice was many things across this whole family's history, but it was rarely subtle, and it was almost never gentle. When he decided a punishment fit, he tended to reuse the format. Not every son turned out a monster, though, and Antiope's story gives you a rather more heroic pair. She was a princess, pursued by Zeus in the shape of a satyr, and bore him twin sons, Amphion and Zethus. Though her own life afterward was anything but easy, persecuted by relatives who blamed her for scandal, she'd had no real hand in causing. Forced to abandon her infant sons on a mountainside where they were raised, eventually, by a kindly shepherd who found them and took them in. The twins grew up strong and capable, each gifted in a different way. Zethus a builder and a herdsman, practical and grounded, while Amphion, in one of the gentler musical gifts this whole family hands out, received a lyre from Hermes himself and grew into a musician whose skill bordered on the magical. Years later, having learned the truth of their birth and rescued their long-suffering mother from the relatives who'd mistreated her, the twin brothers set out to build the Great Walls of Thebes, one of the most famous cities in the whole of Greek myth, home to Oedipus and so many other tragedies still to come in stories beyond tonight's telling. Zethus hauled the stones by main strength, brute labor, one block after another. Amphion, meanwhile, simply played his lyre, and the story goes that the stones, charmed by the music, rose and set themselves into place of their own accord, no lifting required at all. It's a lovely little detail to sit with if you want a single image that captures something true about this whole sprawling family. Even among Zeus's own children, there's always more than one way to build a wall. Some of his sons hauled the weight themselves. Others simply learned to make the weight want to move on its own. And then there's Aegina, whose story matters less for its own sake and more for where it eventually leads, generations down the line, into a war you already know the ending of. She was a river nymph, carried off by Zeus, in the shape of an eagle this time, his favorite disguise by this point in the story, and frankly, the one that required the least explanation once you'd already heard about Ganymede, to an island that would come to bear her own name. She bore Zeus a son there, Aeacus, who grew to become one of the most just and respected mortals in the entire mythology, a king so renowned for his fairness that after his death, the gods themselves appointed him one of the 3 judges of the dead in the underworld. But Aeacus's island came under curse at one point, a plague sent by a jealous Hera, furious as ever at evidence of one of her husband's affairs, that wiped out nearly the entire population in a matter of weeks. Aeacus, left ruling over an almost empty island, prayed to his own father for help, and Zeus, in one of the stranger acts of restoration in everything you've heard tonight, transformed every ant on the island into a fully grown person, a whole new population risen up out of the very soil, tireless and industrious in exactly the way ants are. They were called the Myrmidons, ant people, if you want the plain translation, and they became famous generations later, not through Aeacus himself, but through his grandson. That grandson's name was Achilles. Yes, the same Achilles who fought and died at Troy, greatest warrior of that whole war, leader of the very Myrmidon soldiers, descended from Zeus's Antami solution to a plague his own jealous wife had caused in the first place. It's a strange, looping little detail, but it's the kind of thing that shows up constantly once you start pulling on any single thread in everything you've heard tonight. Nearly every hero, if you trace the family tree back far enough, ends up standing on ground Zeus personally arranged for them, sometimes centuries before they were even born. That's the quiet architecture behind the whole Trojan War, if you want it in one line. A jealous wife's plague, an eagle's disguise, and an island full of ants, all conspiring, generations in advance, to eventually put the greatest warrior in the ancient world on exactly the right battlefield at exactly the right time. Here's something worth stepping back to notice, now that you've heard so many of these individual stories laid out one after another. Nearly every royal house in the entire Greek world, when you trace its family tree back far enough, ends up standing on ground Zeus personally cleared for it. Perseus's line, born from that shower of gold in Danae's bronze tower, became the royal house of Mycenae, the very city that would eventually send Agamemnon to command the whole Greek fleet at Troy. Minos's line, born from a bull on a Cretan beach, gave the ancient world its first great sea power and its most respected code of law, along with, admittedly, one deeply unfortunate monster in a basement. Dardanus's line, born from a Pleiad in the years before the Trojan War even had a city to be fought over, built Troy itself, stone by stone, generation by generation, until it grew wealthy and proud enough to draw the attention of 1,000 ships. Aeacus's line, born from an eagle and a river nymph on an island still bearing her name, produced the Myrmidons and eventually Achilles, the single deadliest weapon either side brought to that entire 10-year war. Add to that the countless smaller lines, kings of Sparta, of Argos, of Thebes, of Arcadia, of half the little city-states scattered across the mainland and the islands, every one of them tracing some thread of ancestry back through a nymph, or a mortal woman, or an unsuspecting queen who once mistook a swan, or a bull, or a shower of gold for something considerably less consequential than it turned out to be. It's worth sitting with the scale of that for a second, because it reframes nearly everything you've heard tonight. This wasn't simply a god with a wandering eye, causing chaos wherever his attention happened to land. This was, in effect, the deliberate, or at least the accumulated, construction of an entire aristocracy. Every king who claimed descent from Zeus wasn't just boasting about ancient prestige. He was making a genuine political claim, one that mattered enormously in a world where legitimacy often rested on exactly this kind of bloodline. Rule by divine right meant something very literal in this whole tangled family. It meant you could point to an actual grandfather, however many generations removed, and that grandfather happened to be sitting on a mountain holding a thunderbolt. And when the Trojan War finally came, when Greek faced Trojan across that beach for 10 straight years, it wasn't simply mortal armies clashing over a stolen queen. It was, in a very real sense, an entire extended family tearing itself apart. Agamemnon, descended from Zeus through Perseus, led an army against a city ruled by Priam, descended from Zeus through Dardanus, while Achilles, descended from Zeus through Aeacus, fought and died alongside them both. Every major bloodline on that battlefield ran back, eventually, to the exact same source. That's the quiet, structural tragedy sitting underneath the whole war, and underneath most of the wars that followed it across the rest of Greek myth and history both. Zeus didn't just father individual children scattered across individual stories. He fathered the entire ruling class of an entire civilization, and then watched, from a considerable height, as that same extended family spent generation after generation finding new and creative ways to destroy each other anyway. Being everyone's great-great-grandfather, it turns out, doesn't make anyone less likely to go to war. It just means that when they do, the casualty reports read a little more like a family reunion gone catastrophically wrong. For centuries after that war ended, Zeus's reign didn't so much continue as it settled, became less about individual stories of conquest and seduction, and more about the everyday architecture of an entire civilization built up around him. If you want to understand how completely this one god soaked into ordinary life, you don't need another myth. You just need to look at what people actually did with his name every single day for the better part of 1,000 years. Every guest who walked through a stranger's door in the ancient world did so under Zeus's own protection. Xenia, they called it, the sacred law of hospitality, and Zeus himself carried the title Xenios because of it, guardian of every traveler far from home. Break that law, mistreat a guest, or abandon one at your door, and you weren't just being rude. You were inviting the personal attention of the king of the gods, and you've already heard, tonight, exactly how that tends to go for the people who try it. Every oath sworn between two people, every treaty signed between two kings, was sworn in Zeus's name, because his was the name too heavy for a liar to risk invoking. Every household kept a small altar to Zeus Hercules, guardian of the courtyard, protector of the home itself. Every king who ruled anywhere in the Greek world understood his own authority as in some sense borrowed directly from Zeus, Diotrephes. They called such kings nurtured by Zeus, a phrase that shows up again and again in the old accounts whenever a ruler needed reminding exactly whose favor kept him on his throne. He traveled well, too, this king, further than most gods ever manage. Out in the Libyan desert, at a lonely oasis called Siwa, Greek travelers encountered an old Egyptian god named Ammon, and rather than treat him as some foreign, unrelated power, they simply decided he and Zeus were the same being wearing two different faces. Zeus Ammon, they called the combined figure, ram-horned, oracle-voiced, respected enough that centuries later, a young conqueror named Alexander would trek across brutal desert sands, specifically to consult that oracle and ask, among other things, whether he himself might be this very god's own son. That's not a small thing to ask an oracle. That's a king reaching all the way back through this whole tangled family tree, hopping to find his own name already written somewhere on one of its branches. And every 4 years, at a sanctuary in the western Peloponnese called Olympia, the entire Greek world set aside its wars, actually set them aside, under a truce so sacred that even bitter rival cities honored it, to gather and compete in Zeus's honor. The Olympic Games. Started, according to legend, by Heracles himself, in tribute to his own father, and running for well over 1,000 years as the single largest recurring celebration in the ancient world, all of it built around one god's name. At the heart of that same sanctuary sat a statue that the ancient world itself considered one of the 7 great wonders worth crossing continents to see, a seated Zeus, carved by the sculptor Phidias, towering some 40 feet high, robed in gold, skin rendered in carved ivory, a throne beneath him decorated with scenes from half the stories you've heard tonight. Pilgrims traveled for weeks, sometimes months, just to stand in that temple and look up into a face meant to capture, as closely as bronze and ivory and gold ever could, the actual weight of ruling everything. One ancient writer said it plainly, that to have seen the statue and died afterward was somehow a lesser misfortune than to die having never seen it at all. That's the kind of reverence this king commanded at the absolute height of his reign, a wonder of the world, built just to hold his likeness still long enough for mortals to look him in the eye. There was an oracle too, older even than the more famous one at Delphi, at a place called Dodona, where priests listened to the wind moving through the leaves of a sacred oak tree, and claimed to hear, in that rustling, the actual voice of Zeus himself, answering questions brought by pilgrims who'd traveled for weeks to ask them. That's what it meant to be the king of the gods in the world that actually worshipped him. Not just myths told around a fire, though there were plenty of those too. Actual temples, actual sacrifices, smoke rising from 1,000 altars on any given morning across the Greek world. Actual oaths that people meant, actual games that stopped actual wars, actual questions carried for actual weeks to hear an actual oak tree answer in his voice. And then slowly, and then all at once, it stopped. The end of Zeus's reign, if you want to call it that, didn't come from a thunderbolt, or a war, or a rival god finally strong enough to take the throne the way Zeus once took it from his own father. It came the way most great powers actually end, historically speaking, quietly, gradually, and then through a series of decisions made by people who had simply stopped believing the old story was true. It started with philosophy, long before it ever reached anything like an ending. Thinkers like Xenophanes, centuries before Zeus's temples ever went dark, had already begun asking uncomfortable questions out loud. If horses could draw, he pointed out, they'd draw their gods to look like horses. Every people everywhere seemed to imagine their gods in their own image, with their own faults, their own jealousies, their own very human weaknesses stitched right into divine bodies. Was that really the shape of the universe, or was it just a mirror dressed up in thunder and lightning? It's a fair question. And once philosophers started asking it seriously, they didn't stop. By the time you get to Socrates, and Plato after him, the whole idea of gods who lied and cheated and turned into swans to chase after mortal women had started to look, to the most careful thinkers in Athens, less like sacred truth and more like very old, very entertaining stories that had simply been treated as literal fact for far too long. Socrates himself was put to death, in part, on charges that included not believing properly in the old gods, proof that the questioning cut deep enough, by then, to genuinely frighten the people still invested in the old order. The worship didn't die there, though. It traveled. When Rome rose to power and swallowed the Greek world the way Cronus had once swallowed his own children, though rather more successfully in Rome's case, Zeus didn't disappear. He simply changed his name. Jupiter, the Romans called him, king of their own gods, carrying nearly every story, nearly every thunderbolt, nearly every family scandal straight over into a new empire that found the old Greek king perfectly compatible with their own ambitions. For centuries more, under a different name, in a different language, the same king kept ruling from the same kind of mountaintop authority, worshipped by an empire that stretched further than the old Greek world ever had. But empires change, and so do the gods they carry. By the time you reach the 4th century after the birth of Christ, a new faith had spread through that same Roman Empire with a speed that must have looked, to anyone still tending an altar to Jupiter, very much like a conquest. And in the year 391, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued a decree that did something no rival god, no monster, no army of titans had ever managed in the entire history of this king's reign. He banned the old worship outright, ordered the temples closed, made the sacrifices, the ceremonies, the whole ancient machinery of Zeus's cult illegal across the entire empire. The oracle at Dodona, where priests had once claimed to hear a god's voice in the rustling of an oak tree, fell silent. The oracle at Delphi, even older and more famous, gave its last recorded prophecy around that same era, and then simply stopped, the voice that had guided kings and cities for 1,000 years going quiet for good. And in 393, the Olympic Games, the celebration Heracles himself supposedly founded in his father's honor, the one that had outlasted wars and empires and centuries of change, were held for the final time before Theodosius's decree shut them down along with everything else. It would be exactly 1,500 years before anyone dared to hold them again, and by then, nobody lit the flame for Zeus. The great statue at Olympia, the 40-foot wand of gold and ivory that pilgrims once crossed continents just to stand beneath, didn't survive the transition either. Accounts differ on its exact end. Some say it was carried off to Constantinople and lost to a palace fire generations later. Others say it simply crumbled where it sat, once the temple around it stopped being maintained and the offerings stopped arriving. Either way, a face that an entire civilization once considered too magnificent to die without seeing, vanished so completely that not one fragment of it survives anywhere in the world today. We only know what it looked like because people wrote it down before it was gone. That's how a king who survived his own father's attempt to eat him, who won a 10-year war against the Titans, who buried a monster under a volcano and an army of giants under mountains and islands, finally lost his throne. Not to a rival, not to a curse, to a change in what people, generation after generation, simply chose to believe was true. And here's the strange, quiet postscript to the whole thing, the part I think about more than almost anything else in everything that's happened so far. The temples closed, the sacrifices stopped, the oak tree at Dodona fell silent, and Zeus, as an object of actual living worship, as a god people prayed to and feared, and genuinely built their oaths around, that Zeus ended. But the stories didn't. Every time someone looks up and finds the constellation of the Great Bear circling the North Star, unable to set, they're looking at Callisto, still carrying Hera's old grudge across the sky. Every time a peacock spreads its tail, somebody's looking at the 100 eyes of a giant who died doing his job too well. Every hurricane, every earthquake near a certain volcano in Sicily carries, if you squint at it through the old lens, the memory of a monster still pinned beneath the mountain a wounded king once dropped on top of him. The word jovial still comes from Jupiter's other name, Jove, because people once believed being born under his influence made you naturally good-humored. The word martial comes from his son. Nearly every planet in your night sky is still named for someone in this family, still quietly announcing every single night, whose story this whole system of stars was originally built to tell. So maybe that's the honest ending, if you want one. Zeus lost his temples, lost his altars, his oracles, his sacrifices, his games. Every single formal, worshipped living piece of his reign came to an end on an emperor's order in the space of about 2 years, after roughly 2,000 years of being the most powerful name in the ancient world. But you're sitting here tonight, by this fire, still hearing his whole story from beginning to end, 3,000 years after it started, and well over a millennium after anyone last knelt at his altar. And that means something did survive, even after the throne itself was gone. Not the god, just the story. Which is, honestly, maybe the only kind of immortality any of them, Titan, Olympian, or otherwise, ever actually managed to hold on to for good. That's the whole of it, friend. Every god falls eventually. The clever ones just make sure somebody's still telling their story long after the fall. Let the fire burn down. You've heard it all now, beginning, middle, and the long, quiet end.